Well, he's from a big city, so I don't know if he's going to have, and there's no heritage buildings in there.
I know. Like Phil says, he goes, I go like, why are we bringing this money and start facing it, right? And Phil goes, well, yeah. Like,
okay, ladies and gentlemen, we will call this meeting to order. Madam Deputy Clerk, can I have a roll call, please?
Councillor Bowen.
Present.
Councillor Candon.
Present.
Councillor George is not here. Councillor Holland.
Present.
Councillor Hutchison. No. Councillor McLaren. No. Councillor Neal.
Present.
Councillor Osterhoff. Present. Councillor Osanic.
Present.
Mayor Patterson.
Present.
Councillor Schell. Councillor Stroud.
Here.
Councillor Turner. Councillor Turner is also absent. Mayor Patterson, we do have a quorum.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to get started in just a moment here. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items. First of all, we have set up council chambers tonight as an overflow room. So while you're, of course, welcome to stand at the back, if you would like to have a seat and watch the proceedings, you're more than welcome to have a seat in council chambers. Great to see so many people out tonight, and welcome to tonight's special council meeting on growth and intensification. This is going to be a slightly different format for a regular council meeting. So what we're going to do in a couple of moments is we're going to invite Mr. Toderian to come and give his presentation. Following that, we will move into a Q&A format. So first I'm going to open it up to members of council to ask any questions of Mr. Toderian, and then after that is done, and then I will open up the floor to members of the public to ask questions of Mr. Toderian as well. What we will do, we have a couple of staff members that will have microphones with them, so if you have a question for the presenter, then please just raise your hand and I'll help to facilitate that. I'll just point you out and you can ask your question. I think just to be fair, I think what we'll do is we'll just ask everyone just please one question until everybody has had a chance to ask questions, and then if we have time, I can entertain a second round after that. Okay, so with that, I'm going to ask Commissioner Lanny Hurdle to provide some introductory remarks and introduce Brent Toderian of Toderian Urban Works, an award-winning Vancouver-based consultancy who will speak to the challenges and opportunities of building higher density communities. Commissioner Hurdle.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Members of council and members of the public, I'm really pleased to be here tonight. This is quite a unique moment that we have in our community in terms of this special council meeting in Town Hall, and to have some obviously expertise at our meeting present to help us through some challenges that we're facing in our community. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I'd like to give a little bit of context for this meeting and how we came about to set up this meeting, and the importance as well of this meeting. So most of you are obviously aware that in the past years, Council has made a number of decisions to really hold the line in terms of our urban growth boundary, which means that we need to find ways to grow within the current boundary that we have. And there are multiple reasons why we would want to do that. One is to prevent urban sprawl. The other is to really focus our investments in terms of infrastructure. And that enables us to do that. But with that, obviously, we need to look at ways of growing within, which really leads to intensification and infill. So we have been, I know, as a community, having a challenge in terms of not so much the concept. I think for the most part, people are very supportive of intensification and infill. But it's more about how is it actually implemented? How do we do intensification and infill in our community? And I also want to stress the importance of growth in our community. And most of you, or some of you, might have seen recently that we have currently the lowest vacancy rate in the province. We have a 0.7 vacancy rate currently in Kingston. That's lower than Toronto and the GTA. That is not good for many reasons. One is we are trying to attract businesses. We're trying to attract people to move to Kingston, young professionals that we need to have working in our different industries and organization. If we don't have places for people to live, we're not going to be a very attractive city. The low vacancy rate also impacts the rental rates. There is no doubt about that. So in terms of affordability, we really need to look at that, and we need to find ways to increase our residential supply. So with that in mind, this is where the intensification and infill become really critical, and I think we need to find a way forward as a community, or I'm hoping that tonight will be the beginning of a larger or longer dialogue about how we can move forward with intensification and infill in our community. And we have asked Mr. Brent Toderian to be here tonight to help us start that dialogue. And it's something that was actually suggested by some members of the community, so I'm not going to take credit for that. This community dialogue was a suggestion that came from some of you, so I do appreciate it. So Mr. Toderian, for those of you who have not had a chance to read his bio, was the former chief planner for the City of Vancouver, is currently a consultant that is doing work not only in Canada in smaller, mid-size, and larger cities, but also doing work worldwide. One of the things that I would like to point out about Mr. Toderian that most people probably don't know is that he's actually from Ontario. He's from Perth, Ontario. So he's from a small town and has had a chance to do work recently in communities such as Burlington and London. So without further delay, I know we're all here to hear from Mr. Toderian. I'm going to ask him to come up to the podium and make his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mayor and members of Council, and to staff and all my new friends and colleagues that I've spent the last 48 hours pretty intensely working with. I am a kind of a local boy, so I jumped at the excuse to come back. I was actually just back in Perth in December visiting my mother, who's still there, and she got to see her grandson, which she was very happy about. But I liked this opportunity to come back because I have fond feelings for and a long history with Kingston, as well as a number of municipalities in this part of the province. So although I do work all over the world now, I try to spend a deliberate amount of my time working for Canadian cities specifically, and if I can do it, cities that have some personal resonance with me, and Kingston is certainly one of those. So it's not random that I'm here, is what I'm saying to you. I'm not a typical consultant in many ways, and I have nothing against consultants, but I'm not a typical one. I use the word advisor more often, and I do most of my work for municipalities, although I will occasionally work for developers if they meet my standard for progressiveness. But my attitude is, my brand is called Advanced Urbanism, and my attitude is I'm a sole practitioner. I haven't tried and don't intend to try to build a company. I put my energy where I think it will do the most good, and I usually get called into cities to help when there is a special moment involved, a transitional moment, a transformational moment, because I don't generally do status quo. I don't do better than average status quo. I'm usually helping people do something significant, something powerful and transformative. And I firmly believe, I was optimistic, and now after 2 days I firmly believe that that is the kind of moment that Kingston is in now. And we'll see how you feel as we move forward after tonight. But that's my perspective. And I say that with some optimism because I've now spent 2 days working with your staff, and I'm here to tell you I feel pretty confident in the positioning you have as a municipality because I've gotten to know your staff, particularly your chief planner, but other members of your senior staff. And I'm not someone who gives compliments if I don't think they're deserved. That just ain't my style. But I say positive things about the opportunity you have because I think you've got an excellent chief planner, and you're on a really interesting path towards transformation of the culture, the skill sets, the tools, the policies, etc. within City Hall, and hopefully well beyond City Hall. So there are going to be points in my talk tonight because I'm going to be challenging everyone involved in the city-making process to rethink differently. There are going to be points tonight where staff may be shuffling in their seats, other points where mayor and council may be shuffling in their seats, other points, if the development industry is listening out there, they're going to be shuffling in their seats, and community activists are going to be shuffling in their seats. Because I'm not here to sugarcoat my observations in terms of the challenge you have before you, to frankly intensify better than you have been. I've titled my talk, Density Done Well in a Kingston by Design. That's not accidental. A lot of my advice to cities is not about densification as a mathematical exercise, intensification as a mathematical exercise, because I'm not a fan of that approach. What I'm a fan of is a qualitative conversation about how to densify successfully, how to densify well, how to improve quality of life, livability, sustainability, public health, fiscal responsibility, costs of infrastructure as you densify. And I know, I don't believe, I know that there are ways to do that. And I know there are ways to do it badly. And I'm going to be sharing some observations about both of those. Your city wants to become Canada's most sustainable city. I know because I read it on your Twitter bio. I actually know because I've read your past council's strategic plan and your current council's strategic plan. And the current council's strategic plan has added language around doing it in a way that also emphasizes smart city building and livable city building, which is completely synergistic with the goal of being a sustainable city. I hope now that I haven't embarrassed you by pointing that out, that your communications department isn't immediately going to go and change your Twitter bio. I didn't do it for that reason. It's good that you're putting that goal. I like the power of goals. I notice you didn't give yourself a deadline. You should give yourself a deadline. You should feel a sense of urgency. We should all feel a sense of urgency, because even the cities that are improving and progressing, in my observation, are often not improving and progressing fast enough. And when it comes to consequences like sustainability, we don't have all the time in the world. We have to establish a greater sense of urgency. So good on you for having it in your bio, more importantly in your strategic plan. And I take that very seriously. And all your citizens and I will be the folks that say, so are you doing what's necessary to actually achieve that? Because it's an easier thing to say than it is to achieve. I don't need to tell mayor and council that, or staff that. So the question is, what would it really take to be the most sustainable city in Canada? And are you willing to do those things? Because many of those things will involve not just tweaks, but dramatic changes in how you've been doing things up till now. It will take dramatic changes in how council perceives right and wrong things to do, how staff do their business, their work, the skill sets that staff have, how the community interacts and what buttons the community pushes in the processes of city making, how the development industry behaves and the expectations on the development industry. Everyone's going to need to change if you take that seriously. So one of my key messages, Mr. Mayor and Council, how bad do you want that? Right now, the most sustainable city in the world, if you believe certain metrics, is Vancouver. So you've got stiff competition. But I actually believe you could do it. I actually want every city to strive for that goal and end up in a tie. There are a lot of issues that we are facing at every level of society, every level of government, where smarter city making, essentially the things that are under the control of this council, are the key basis for success around. Whether you're motivated by climate change and lowering our carbon footprint, public health, and its demonstrated connection to how we design and build our cities, particularly how we get around, housing affordability, unpredictable energy costs. I used to say high energy costs, but then they go up and the question are down, and the question is, when are they going to go back up again? What implication does that have for energy dependent places like our suburbs, frankly? Aging and changing population. We talk a lot about the aging population, but we don't talk about enough about the fact that because of the age of the baby boomers are no longer the largest demographic group on planet Earth. The millennials are. And every city is competing for the millennials, because that's going to be the basis of your tax base. So the two biggest demographic groups in human history, the boomers and the millennials, are both big challenges for cities. And that plays out in news releases like Amazon is looking for a second headquarters and every single city in Canada starts competing. What that really is a competition for millennials, and because those are the people that work at Amazon. And civic identity. As you're intensifying, does it look like every other place? This is a critical issue, I don't need to tell you, for your community. One of the most historically significant cities in Canada. How do you densify in a way that just doesn't look like everything else? What's a made in Kingston approach to intensification? That doesn't mean reinventing the wheel, but it means looking at ways to integrate your character and identity into the built result. So whether you're motivated by climate change, and there is a direct connection between our carbon footprint and the way we build cities, even the big cities know it. New York City has just started a process to sue the big oil companies. My response to them was, have you done everything you can within the things that are within your city control to affect climate change? New York City rests on its laurels in terms of a lot of development that happened 100 years ago, but are you making the right decisions today? If you're not motivated by climate change, you should be motivated by the incredibly powerful connection between public health and city making. I've noticed over the last 5 years that my most important allies in a conversation with the public, with elected leaders about how we build cities, are doctors and public health care officials. I think as humans, we're trained to listen to our doctors, maybe more so than our city planners or our climate scientists. Because when doctors speak, it gets noticed. The 4 top public health care officials around the GTA held a press conference on walkable cities and public transit and density. And it got a ton of press. And if the 4 chief planners of those regions had held a press conference, I don't think the media would have come. But the doctors get the intention, and they're changing the conversation. I'm doing work in multiple cities in Australia talking about densification, walkable communities, public transit support, etc. And my clients, if you think I've been called in by the development industry so that they can make more profit, my clients are the Heart Foundation of Australia. And they brought me in to help influence and motivate state-level governments and local governments about how to do intensification more successfully, because they know it's directly tied to prevention of heart disease and a whole bunch of other preventable health epidemics that are not only killing a lot of people, but causing billions of dollars of costs in our public health care costs. So the conversation is a heck of a lot more complex than density just being a thing that developers want because they want to make more profit. That's just not what's driving this conversation, no pun intended. And if you're not motivated by public health, maybe you're motivated by good old-fashioned cash. Cities in Canada are in the lead internationally and inspiring other cities around the world now in doing the better math around the costs of how we build. Infill versus greenfields, up versus out, different levels of densification relative to infrastructure costs and taxation that can literally mean the difference, and has meant the difference in some American cities, between success and bankruptcy being called by municipalities. One of your peer cities, and one of my favorite cities that I've worked in, Halifax, did one of the best studies, I think, of looking at the costs of different ratios of how much of your growth goes to the suburbs versus goes into inner city infill. And just making slight variations in that percentage of growth resulted in billions of dollars of municipal cost, your money, being spent to essentially subsidize certain growth patterns when other growth patterns more than pay for themselves and actually generate net revenue for the city. It's really hard for politicians and leaders and activists and anyone to ignore this kind of math once they know it. I actually think it's one of the most powerful, game-changing conversations that's been happening in the conversation about where to put our growth and how to design our growth. Because if you're not motivated by altruism like climate change and public health, almost everybody seems to be motivated by money, whether it's public money or individual money. And ultimately, it's all individual money. And Halifax is a peer city of yours. It's a similar scale, it's similar challenges, etc. I say that cities and suburbs are changing faster probably than the planning conversation has had previously, not because of an ideology about where people should live and whether they should ride a bike versus drive a car, but because of better math. We're quantifying the costs better than we have before. We're connecting the dots between real-life implications like life and death scenarios of public health and diseases and big issues like climate change. We've got better math and better understanding of this, and a factual basis for having a conversation about intensification that is irrefutable. It is irrefutable. The question is, how are we going to do it well? The bad news is, if you think technology is going to save us, the driverless car is going to be the solution or whatever, I can't tell you how many mayors I've had to have the conversation that, no, Mr. Mayor or Madam Mayor, you don't get to defund public transportation because driverless cars are going to be the solution. It's not going to be the solution. As a matter of fact, depending on the details, it might lead to an awful lot more driving. It may be a bigger problem for us. If science isn't going to save us and tech isn't going to save us, demographics are going to certainly help. The perspective of the millennials around driving and different ways of getting around and choice about where to live in neighborhoods and urban living, even as they're getting to the age where they are having kids, if we design for that in our urban places, we keep the millennials, we attract the millennials. And the cities that are attracting that talent for the tax base, for the job base, etc., are the ones that are providing suburbs that are more walkable and multimodal, and urban places that can still accommodate millennials when they start to have kids. Both of those things are entirely possible. We just haven't necessarily been doing it that way up till now. The largest demographic group on planet Earth. Their parents, originally the largest demographic group in history, well, it is the largest demographic group in history, increasingly want the same things. I hope none of you are insulted. I once had a seniors advocate say that term broken hipster is a terrible term, very insulting. And I said, it's not my term, it's the Wall Street Journal, but admittedly I am putting it on a slide. Why I like it is because it catches people's attention that the baby boomers are making the choices that we tend to associate with the so-called hipsters. They want walkable neighborhoods, they want choice in how to get around, they want to be close to their grandkids. They are choosing urban places, and since the boomers have the money, they're beating their kids in the real estate battle. But the two demographic groups are both increasingly saying this is the kind of development we want, the kind of places we want to live in. And the same old suburban model just isn't cutting it. And the demographic group in between, the age groups that are having families, the typical narrative, they don't want to live downtown, they don't want to live in urban places. As soon as they have kids, they're going to move out of the downtown and go to the suburbs. In Vancouver, we have 7,000 children in our downtown peninsula. 6,800 or so more than we had a couple of decades ago, because we designed specifically for families and kids to be a part of that urban living, and instead of other cities who have basically created a self-fulfilling prophecy for themselves by designing in a way that virtually repels families. And then they say, see, no families want to live in our urban places. But you don't have any 2- and 3-bedroom units that can fit families, or in your case, your challenge is you have those, but they get taken up by students. You don't have schools and daycare and other supports that facilitate families. You haven't designed your public realm in a kid-friendly way. And then you say, see, the families don't want to come. We did the opposite of all that, and we have 7,000 children. And there are multiple cities around the world, including some of your competitive cities with you from a scale perspective, that are in the process of specifically changing the way they build urban places for families. And it is completely possible. You just have to want it. And I can tell you all of these things, but at some point, I suspect everyone in this room is going to think what I often call the 8 most unhelpful words in the English language, which is, we could never do that in our city. It's amazing how much energy goes into convincing me that what I'm talking about is impossible here because of fill in the blank. Climate, culture, history, tradition, politics, economics. What I've found, and I work across Ontario, I work across Canada, I work across North America, I work across the world. And I've worked in some of the most successful cities in terms of attention, accolades like most livable or most innovative, etc. And what I found is that the cities that are actually achieving anything they want are the ones that have a clear vision, they have the will and skill to pull it off, and they emphasize follow-through instead of talking. I work in parts of the country that are great at follow-through. Canadian cities often not so great at follow-through. We can do a lot of talking, but are you actually carrying forward and doing the tough things that are necessary to make your vision a reality when it comes to how you write your budget, how you do other things? This is one of the ways I put it. The truth about a city's aspiration isn't found in its vision, it's found in its budget. The budget is my favorite example of follow-through. I see city after city with policy that says we're going to be a multimodal city. Walking and biking transit is going to be delightful. And then I look at their budget and see that the actual money that's going towards active transport is a rounding error in the conversation. The budget reveals the truth in terms of where your real priorities are. Every city should have to, when they are in budget time, directly prove that where they're putting their money is going to be supportive in implementing their stated council strategic plan, their stated official plan, their vision. It's not easy when you're starting from a place of less than perfection, shall we say, to start to get it right. And I've observed over my career that there's a sort of stages of the evolution in how to go from doing it wrong to doing it right. You start off by doing the wrong thing, and you folks have been doing a lot of the wrong thing. Most cities have been doing a lot of the wrong thing when it comes to smarter city making. Then you evolve to doing the wrong thing better, and you can spend decades in that era. If you're wondering what I mean, I'll give you a really simple example, but I can give you 1,000 examples. You're still building big box retailing that's completely car dependent on your suburbs, but you've got a new policy that calls for improved landscaping in the parking lot. So people won't be so frightened walking from their parked car to the... That's an example of doing the wrong thing better. Driverless cars, by the way, is an example of doing the wrong thing better, because we don't need more driving. Then I often see cities in what I call the state of trying to have their cake and eat it too. They're starting to invest. If I look at their budget, they're starting to invest in infrastructure for walking, biking, and transit. But they're still doubling and tripling down on car infrastructure. They're still widening roads, and they're wondering why there's no mode shift. They're wondering why more and more people are still driving, and not more people are walking, biking, and taking public transit. As you densify, if you still have the same number of people driving, or even more people driving, your densification is going to be unsuccessful. By definition, mathematically, geometry, if you have more and more people and they're all trying to drive, it doesn't fit. I'm going to get more into that, but the point is, it's one of the most common examples of trying to have your cake and eat it too. So how are you stopping doing the wrong things at the same time as you're starting to do the right things? You have to make choices, tough choices. And then ultimately, you might get to be doing the right thing. This is not an absolute in city making. You can almost go on an issue-by-issue basis in Kingston and ask yourself, where are we in this? Somebody said to me today, I think we're in stage 2, doing the wrong thing better. And I said, you might be in stage 2 in certain issues. In some issues, you might be doing the right thing. In some issues, you're still stuck back in stage 1. The point is not to be absolute. The point is for you to think about what success looks like. Because as an example, I often tell my clients, don't get me wrong, I'll give you some credit for doing the wrong thing better. Because if you're going to do the wrong thing, you might as well do it better. But don't mistake that for success. Don't mistake that. If you're going to keep building big box, I'd prefer you to improve the landscaping in the parking lot. But you need to stop doing big box. And don't mistake those things. So as one other way I put it, progress doesn't just depend on starting doing the right things, it depends on stopping doing the wrong things, and even going back and starting to fix your mistakes. It's important to say that because politically, Council, it's a lot easier to start to do the right things. You get a lot of credit for that, you can do a media release. It's actually harder to stop doing the wrong things, because now you have people mad at you that are calling you up and saying, I'm used to doing the wrong thing, how dare you tell me I can't do it anymore? It's hard politically to stop doing the wrong thing, but it's incredibly important if you really actually want to start making progress. Yes, I was chief planner of Vancouver. I don't just use Vancouver examples. I have worked in every scale of city, and yes, I grew up originally in a small town. Vancouver gets a lot of attention, not as a big city, but just as a city that has been doing things right. And you can start to, once you get on a roll, you can get attention for a lot of things, not just livability, healthy, reputable, visitable from a tourism perspective, but top coffee city, top beach city. You get some crazy ones. My clients in Colombia laugh when I put up that slide about top coffee city. They think none of us understand coffee. But the key line in there is economically successful city. None of this is airy-fairy. None of this is, boy, it'd be nice to have it if we could afford it. All of this is proven. Everything I'm going to talk about in this talk is proven in terms of success, including economic success. One of the things you need to be able to embrace as you talk about densification is the value of design. And the conversation about design tends to focus on beautification. which seems like a superficial thing, a skin-deep thing, something nice to have if you have the spare budget. My conversation with you is, one of my conversations with your staff is about how to get to a culture of urban design where design is essential in the successful delivery of everything you're trying to accomplish, and it is a value creator. I created this slide for the Mayor of Sydney, Australia, who had me help them with this evolution thinking about how to perceive design as a critical component to more successful densification. I'm not going to read it out, but you can see all the ways that good design has a demonstrated track record of economic success for the private sector and for the public sector, which is more important specifically for you. I'm less motivated about whether developers make profit, but I'm really concerned about the economic stability of cities. Put in a more simple way, beauty outperforms ugly, and it's remarkable how expensive ugly can be. So there is I want you to think about beauty as a critically important component of this conversation, not just because it's nice to have, but it's a value creator with a great return on investment, demonstrated track record. If you think Vancouver is mostly tall buildings, yes, we have tall buildings. That's the downtown in the foreground, and we have many places where tall buildings are allowed, contemplated within the urban pattern in Vancouver. But as you can see, a lot of Vancouver is low-rise. And then when you go to the rest of the city region, you see all sorts of variables. The point is, we and all good cities do densification in all sorts of scales, in all sorts of contexts. But the key thing is we emphasize quality design at every scale. We don't get into fights about whether a certain scale, like tall buildings, are inherently bad or inherently good. We focused on the design quality of every outcome, and I'm going to get a lot more into that. Once you get out of that city proper, you get to where one of the real challenging areas are. I've spent a lot of the first 2 days with your staff talking about inner city infill, but let's be clear. I know you've got a lot of suburbs. I know you're still going to keep building suburbs. It's where most of you live, and it's where most of the new residents are still going to go. So you need to be dramatic in your transformational thinking about how to do suburbs better. I don't, like many urbanists, vilify the suburbs. Even if I wanted to, what's the point of that? But I point this out. The success or failure of our city regions and ultimately our survival is going to depend on how well we do our suburbs. We can do our inner city almost perfectly. But if we continue to do our suburbs badly from a climate change, economic cost perspective, public health perspective, all the things I've been talking about, we're still in deep trouble. This is the generational challenge we have. But one of the ways we make the suburbs better is by taking the pressure off the suburbs by doing more inner city infill, more people living in, frankly, more urban and more successful patterns. Not all suburbia is sprawl, this term you have, but let's be clear, too much of it is. And the key defining characteristic of sprawl is autodependency. If you need the car to do basically everything you need to do, and you're telling me, Brent, I need my car. Don't tell me to get on a bike or take public transit. I need my car. I say, I believe you, and that's a failure of the way we've designed that suburb. We've designed that suburb so you need a car for everything. We need to design suburbs differently, so you have choices. This is why suburbs fail. Not because I inherently care more or less about a single detached house versus an apartment. This is the problem. So suburbs all over North America are changing. They're becoming more urban, not everywhere, but in key places. This is one of the suburbs of Vancouver where we put transit infrastructure, our SkyTrain infrastructure out there. You see a SkyTrain station in the middle of what was a suburban 1960s shopping center with a sea of parking. That's not unfamiliar to you. You have that. And, you know, don't be too focused on the type of transit infrastructure, because I know you don't have light rail yet, and hopefully at some point you will. But the point is what you can do when you start to rethink the potential of that land out in the suburbs. This is actually under construction. The phase one is almost finished, of a transit-oriented, mixed-use, high-density community in the suburbs as a new growth area, a new urban place in the suburbs. One of the most interesting things about this slide, you see the shadowed or ghosted towers in the back there? Those are the only part of this picture that are actually on top of the mall. The entire thing in the foreground that you see, those towers, that public realm, is all built where the parking was. We haven't even had to touch the mall yet. and interfere with the operations of that mall, which shows how much space we're giving away to parking. And you don't need the transit for that to be true for you. When I go to your malls, I see that same sea of parking. I see that same opportunity for a different kind of building. We're doing transit corridors, vertical corridors, horizontal corridors going through the urban places running along transit. There's no right answer to this. This is a transit corridor that I oversaw the planning of called the Canby Corridor. There, at the stations, there's much higher density, both higher and more dense, and those two things are not exactly the same thing. But in between stations, it's a prevailing scale of 6 stories. I know there are people in the community that think 6 stories is the optimal, ideal scale in every context. I happen to like 6-story form, but I don't believe it's the answer everywhere. It is the predominant answer in this particular corridor, but not at the station areas, or not in the neighborhood centers, or what have you. But it shows you can start to have a sophisticated conversation about the type of density, the type of scale, the type of built form in different contexts to achieve different public goals, including transit ridership, walkability, complete communities, etc. This is a slide I actually created when I was chief planner, when I was going out to community groups like you. I remember in one couple of month period I went to 53 community groups and talked about density, because it's important for members of the public sector to be talking about why we're talking about intensification at all. Because let's be candid, in the absence of that, the narrative tends to be, well, if they're talking about density, it's because developers want to make more profit. And if a planner is talking about density, it must be because the planner is in the pocket of that developer. Let me be clear, I have no time for that kind of narrative. Planners don't do that. But you need to be constant and persuasive in your conversation about why it is in the public interest, a necessity to be talking about intensification. Reduced energy use in buildings allows active transport. Frankly, it does more than allow them. It creates the opportunity for them. It makes them possible. More green design options, many of which are dependent on certain levels of density, like cogeneration. District energy is a game changer in terms of solving climate change, and it's only possible with certain levels of density. Less sprawl, less pressure on agricultural land, industrial land, less pressure on heritage buildings if you can intensify elsewhere, more affordable housing choices, improve public health. Even the stats show more safe, more diverse, more inclusive. Just about everything you can quantify, and many things you can, show that density is a net positive if you do it well. And I always make that distinction because there is such a thing as bad density. There is such thing as poorly designed density, unsuccessful density. But if you do it well, this is what you can achieve. This is why the public sector needs to be talking about densification. And listen, I want developers to make profit, because all the things I'm talking about are dependent on developers building things. But I could care less how much profit they make. I want them to make enough profit that they keep doing it, because every single thing I talk about is dependent on developer profit. But developers have to radically readjust their sense of expectation. And that comes from the public sector sending the message of what the public expects from developers in terms of the quality of built product, built form, built city. So 3 elements. Somebody's going to need to tell me how I am for time, because I don't want to go more than 40 minutes. Give me a warning when I have like 10 minutes left. Maybe I'm already there. Okay. Well, I'm going to go fast then, so buckle up. There are 3 elements to density done well, and I am going to go through them quickly. The first is to make sure that you're doing your land use and your mobility in an aligned way, that you're thinking about how people move and where people live in the same conversation. A lot of city halls still have a bit of a disconnect. I'm getting a sense that you're in pretty good shape here in terms of that relationship between land use and mobility, but I do have a sense it could improve. How we get around is a critical component to how we do density. I'm here to tell you, if you think the solution to densification is to widen roads, that won't work. It doesn't fit. You can't widen the roads wide enough, frankly. And we know that when you widen roads, it just induces people to do more driving. The concept is called induced demand, or the law of congestion. Our transportation engineers in Vancouver know that the best transportation plan is a great land use plan. You get your land use right, it makes walking, biking, and public transit highly viable. And then if you do the infrastructure right, you make it enjoyable. But if you get your land use wrong, it's really hard. So this aligned conversation, this mutual shared definition of success between land use and transportation is critical. The most important policy that Vancouver ever passed was in the 1990s, and it said we're not balancing ways of getting around, we're prioritizing walking, biking, and public transit, then goods movement, and then the private automobile. We don't ban the private automobile. There's still driving in Vancouver. We actually have the same level of driving in Vancouver that we had in 1970. And I say the same, that's the wrong way of putting it. It went up, and then it went back down to 1970s levels because of our improvements in public transit, walking, and biking, which is a huge international success story, but it takes prioritization. Balance is code usually for the status quo. When I see a plan that calls for balance, I have a sense that the city isn't all that serious. First of all, if you look at it just pragmatically, the cars had a head start for about 50 years. So even if your goal is balance, you've got to prioritize walking, biking, and transit. It's like a 100-yard dash and you've given the car an 80-yard head start. You've got to prioritize walking, biking, and transit if you want to have multimodal success, and it's critically tied to intensification, because if you add to your population in a way that's car-supported, you've got problems, you've got trouble. If you design a city for cars, it fails for everyone, including drivers. If you design a multimodal city, it works better for everyone, including drivers. I want you to understand, this is one of my most important messages, that as we move in this direction, this is not an anti-car message. It's not a war on the car. That's a Rob Ford line. What it is a recognition that that's how cities work better for everyone, and it makes driving work better. And if you're not sure why, just picture the idea that if you really need to drive, the best thing for you is that this person walks and this person takes public transit and that person rides a bike. Because if they're all competing with you for that finite road space, you're not going to move well. Simple geometry. When you're emphasizing walking, you've got to think about the architecture better. When I'm walking around your city, and that was my first tweet that got the attention in the WIG Standard, I saw a lot of blank walls. We are constantly thinking about the vertical experience of the pedestrian, the city at eye level at 5 kilometers an hour that basically rewards the pedestrian for walking. You're spending a lot of time on the public realm design, but the track record of performance around the architecture at grade is frankly weak. So how to do that much better in terms of creating that expectation? New York went through the process of breaking down the elements of the street wall to make sure that they were putting attention on every aspect. You don't need to be that complex. In Vancouver, our simple line was no blank walls. A 3-line policy for walkability, no blank walls. It's not quite that simple, I'm oversimplifying, but you get the point. It's really important. And as we think about how streets and public spaces are designed, yes, we should be thinking about moving people, not just cars. That's advanced thinking when it comes to mobility. But we also need to think of streets as places that aren't just for movement. I started in our new transportation plan calling them sticky streets because it was about streets that actually encourage you not to move, to stay, to people watch, to linger, to enjoy other citizens, to sit on a patio. And are you designing your public realm in a way that actually facilitates and supports that and makes the streets sticky? When it comes to biking, which is the second priority, the transformation around urban biking in the last 5 years has been remarkable. And every city that's competing with the Amazons or competing for the Amazons or competing for millennials is suddenly trying to build really fast bike infrastructure, because that's one of the keys to attracting that demographic talent base. I won't talk a lot about that. Sorry if there's bike activists in the room that want me to talk for a lot about it, but I will say the absolute key to getting mode shift increase in bikes, particularly on busy, fast roads, is separation. Separated bike lanes. If you aren't willing to go with separation, if you're trying to have cyclists share the streets with traffic, you're going to be limited in your success. I won't say you won't improve, but you're going to be limited in your success. This is one of our first bike lanes, Hornby, and it was started as a pilot and then became permanent. You can learn from us in Vancouver. We are now the first Canadian city to get to double digits in bike share. 10% of our trips are by bike. And by North American standards, that's great. When I go to my Scandinavian city clients, they kind of chuckle at me and with a bit of sympathy because they're up in 35, 45%. But by North American standards, that's pretty impressive. My main message to you is don't do what we did and do it really slowly. One bike lane at a time, one pilot at a time. I call it pulling the Band-Aid off slowly. Every time we did a new bike lane in Vancouver, I had to go to the media and answer the two same questions. Why are there no cyclists? Well, because we don't have a complete network. And are we done now? No, we're not done because we don't have a complete network. But that's what happens when you do it slowly, and the public gets frustrated because they don't see success. So do what Calgary did, which learned from our mistake. We had a lot of conversations with them, and when they built a bike lane pilot for their downtown, they built it as a relatively complete network. One of the most successful pilots of any type, and certainly bike lane pilots that I've seen anywhere in North America. So if you're interested in bike lane infrastructure, I know you've got conversations about a bike master plan and such. You've got a budget for that, and my advice is front-end the budget and build a system, or else you're just going to be in for a lot of political pain over time because you're pulling the Band-Aid off slowly. Essentially, this is what it comes down to. We're trying to add a lot more people, and yet we're not reprioritizing the space to accommodate that. The amount of people getting squeezed into small spaces and moving more people in order to protect the room for the individual driver in the individual car is causing a lot of this challenge. You've all seen this kind of, many of you have probably seen this kind of drawing or picture. It's the, you know, the relative space taken up by the car, the bus, the pedestrian, the cyclist. And it isn't even accurate because this is how much space it takes when they're not moving. We all know that when cars are moving, they take way more space than that. But I still like this kind of thing. I collect them. Mayors now send them to me because they know I tweet them. And I've probably got about 150 of them. My favorite one is from my recent clients in Santiago, Chile, because they introduced the additional element of, you see the bus caught in the same traffic. It makes the extra point on top of the space point, which is that when you don't separate your bus infrastructure, you have all those people stuck in the same traffic in all of those cars, which is a very good extra point. There's all sorts of creative ways to make the point about how much less space is necessary, in this case bike parking, how many bikes you can park in the space of a parked car. But it's all about, you have to understand that mobility in cities, especially as you're adding population and densifying, is about space. An electric car won't solve that, a driverless car won't solve that. It's ultimately about space when cars move and when cars park. The second element of density done well is a high-quality design standard. I've already talked about that. You need, as a culture change, to change your culture, your tools, your systems to deliver better quality, and particularly as you're talking about height, which I know is one of your, if not the critical element that you constantly are debating and discussing in this city. This is our waterfront. I've taken pictures and tweeted your waterfront and had some comments. Maybe you don't like our waterfront. This is early generation. This is 15, 20 years ago. But what you see is height. But what you see is separation of buildings. And they all land on a podium that activates a street and has a very strong human scale. And there's separation for privacy and sunlight access and views, etc. What you would do in this thing is you'd squash all those buildings because you're afraid of how tall they are. And you would create a wall on your waterfront, which is what you did in the past. I'm not saying you would do this, but based on the narrative I hear, that's where the pressure would be. And instead of tall buildings, you would have a wall blocking your entire waterfront, cutting it off. No opportunity to layer views and public benefit to the water into the city, as is done very carefully in Vancouver. And the reason for that is because you're having a conversation about density that is one-dimensional, how tall the buildings are, how many floors the buildings have. And you're resulting, in my opinion, in my observation, with much worse buildings that are slightly less tall. You can't even say they're short. They're just slightly less tall, but they're a lot worse in terms of the actual performance in all the ways we can measure, and in many ways we can't measure, but the performance of density, whether it's shadowing on public spaces or privacy or view blockage or all sorts of things like that. So one of the things Vancouver is known for is doing the podium, which your architects have started to borrow from, I've seen, and there's some progress, I think, in the quality of the conversation about the podium. But the towers are separated and they're stepped back, and they don't determine the human scale of the experience, because the podium does that. But the towers aren't fat, they're slim, they're elegant. It's really important as you're doing tall buildings that you do tall buildings well. I call this the Montparnasse effect. This is the Montparnasse Tower in Paris. It was the first tall tower built in Paris ever. And it was awful and hated. I call it the middle finger to the Montparnasse neighborhood. And for 50 years after this, Paris didn't allow any more tall buildings until La Défense, which is technically outside Paris. That's what happens when you, as a city, approve something that's bad. Some people think that I am pro-tower, that I am pro-density. My message is, I like all buildings if they're designed well, and if they're in the right context and are done for the right reasons. And I hate buildings that are not only bad, but destroy your ability to have a credible conversation in the future about density. You know, that building cost everyone the opportunity to have a conversation about whether tall buildings were good or not. And I'm not sure the answer in the Paris context, but that ended the conversation because of how bad that was. If you're interested in my narrative or my conversation about that, write down that title, Tall Towers Debates Could Use Less Dogma and Better Design, and I talk in depth about that. What we've got to get to is a conversation about the quality of tall buildings, just like we talk about the quality of mid-sized buildings and the quality of low-rise buildings. We make sure they're not vertical sprawl in the sense that they are not car-oriented and badly designed at the street, but just because they're tall, they're not vertical sprawl. You can be vertically urban or vertical sprawl. It depends on what happens when you ride down the elevator, which I consider a form of public transit. If you ride down the elevator and get into your parking garage and vomit out onto the expressway, and there are literally projects I've seen that do that, direct on-ramps onto the expressway, that is vertical sprawl. If you ride down the elevator and walk your kids to school or walk to the grocery store, that is vertical urbanism. That is about the quality of the tall tower design and the nature and quality of the neighborhood. That's got to be the conversation about tall buildings. Instead, what a lot of Ontario cities have is a focused conversation about the number of floors. My clients in Burlington, Ontario, just next to Hamilton, if you know Burlington, we had a very similar conversation about tall buildings, and I pointed out to them, I went around taking pictures of their tall buildings. And I said, man, if I thought these were the tall buildings you were going to be building, I would hate tall buildings too. But I could name you 25 horrible things about these buildings before I even mention height. And yet the conversation was in Burlington almost entirely about how tall the buildings were. And in the downtown, different architecture, different materials, but the same basic issue. Huge slab buildings that were frankly very poorly designed, blocked views, all sorts of things. But they weren't tall, and there was a perspective that that was success. Frankly, they are pretty tall. They're just tall and fat. So here's yours. Here's your waterfront. Here's your other places. I've had some people say, well, what's wrong with that, Brent? That looks perfectly fine to me. The relationship with the street is unurban. They're both tall and fat. Nobody can tell me that that's a short building. You folks have built a lot of slab towers, and a lot of the proposals you have coming forward, because most of the conversation is about how tall they are, and your council and your staff are very sensitive to the perception that the public doesn't like height, you're basically squashing them down into badly designed, slightly less tall buildings, is my observation for you. What I want for you is a much more sophisticated, intense, multifaceted conversation about how to do density and height well, and not just be focused on how tall the buildings are. Do you recognize this? It was meant to vilify tall buildings. I actually agree with this slide because I look at the proportion of that tall building and I'd say that's a bad tall building too. It's way too big, right? And here's another one. Do you recognize this one? Is the artist in the room? This is a false choice, though. If I had to choose between those two futures for Kingston, I'd probably choose the top one. But I don't know anyone who would think the bottom one is a good idea. And the bottom one is not what we are talking about. There are opportunities to do strategically located tall buildings and, by definition, defining where they shouldn't go, tall buildings, and make sure they get designed better. That's just horrible, ugly, bad, monolithic tall buildings. That's a false choice. That's a straw man, as they say. Okay? That's not your two choices. There is a middle way that is about the quality of design at every scale. Mr. Mayor, I'm going to fast forward through some things to get to some key messages. I just want to say with this, the third element of density done well is how you bring the amenities into the conversation and achieve them through tools like density bonusing, which is one of the most important tools you have as a city to make sure you're building the amenities that make the density livable and lovable as you intensify. And I know there are constantly challenges from your development industry, etc., about whether you should be using tools like density bonusing or other charges. You need to. Because you, like every other municipality in Canada, can't afford to keep up on the amenities that make density successful unless you use these tools. Frankly, you should be using them more. And that's one of the meetings I'm going to have with your staff tomorrow. Because that's the way you achieve not just overcrowding, but density that actually succeeds. When combined with multimodal design and great urban design in general, that's how you get livable density. That's how you get livable intensification and lovable intensification, because you're preserving things like heritage, etc., that people love and bring character. So public spaces and daycare and rental housing maybe in the conversation of a more diverse neighborhood, not just a livable one. Cultural facilities, community and civic facilities, anything that supports that densification. Community pools is a big issue in one of the cities I'm working in right now. So density and design at great density, great design at every scale, but without having this inherent scale dogma that says anything above 6 stories is inherently evil. It's not. Bad design is evil, in my opinion. And you can determine the quality of your outcome. Just to show you that Vancouver doesn't just do tall buildings, we're actually very good at mid-rise, too. And the predominant pattern in Vancouver is actually mid-rise. Tall towers are not allowed in Vancouver, in most of Vancouver. But where they are allowed, the emphasis is on making sure they are done well. Because we've gotten past this sort of simplistic narrative about tall towers, good or bad, yes or no. And it's a conversation about where not, how. Our Olympic Village, for example, which is probably our most famous neighborhood, this was the Athletes' Village for the 2010 Winter Games, named the greenest community in North America, it's all mid-rise. There was debate about whether it should be high-rise. We said, no, we want to show we do mid-rise really well. Greenest community in North America. And I can show you plenty of pictures of that. The point is that at every scale, the conversation is about quality design, good urbanism, good densification, and never a one-size-fits-all approach. But a conversation in every part of your community, in urban places, in more low-density places. I say that because there's a very important conversation for you to be having about ground-oriented forms of densification. My friend Dan Perolik in San Francisco calls it the missing middle between single-detached houses and the mid-rise or high-rise. It's all those ground-oriented things like duplexes, row houses, courtyard row houses, etc., that we haven't been building. To be clear, these are not things that you do instead of tall towers in places where tall towers make sense. These are things you do, frankly, in the low-density neighborhoods when you want to have more opportunities for those neighborhoods to evolve over time. And if I had more time, I'd get more into that, but the point is you can completely have a conversation about how to densify in low-density neighborhoods that the public can actually come on board with. If you have a conversation about the nature of change versus stability, so-called stability in your neighborhoods. I use terms in the Vancouver conversation like gentle density, hidden density, and invisible density to talk about secondary suites, laneway houses, row houses, etc., and how they could actually stabilize neighborhoods, because in many neighborhoods your population is dropping, your local inner-city school is under threat of closure, because the empty nesters haven't downsized, because they don't have unit types in their neighborhood to downsize to. It's remarkable how these kinds of housing forms can actually add to the stability, help with the stability of neighborhoods. And then you get simple ideas like laneway housing. You folks have some lanes. This was thought of as a very small idea when I was championing it. Now we have over 2,500 approved laneway houses around the single-family neighborhoods, what I called hidden density at the time. The point is all sorts of different scales. So if you think that I'm talking about a place like Vancouver where the density conversation is very easy, but the density conversation is very hard in your city, this is a pretty typical headline in Vancouver. The densification conversation is very hard in Vancouver. It's very hard in every city I work in. You are not special in that sense. Your conversation is hard. I liked your cartoons about density. Here's one that our local community did. This was a poster that was done when a transit corridor, a main spine transit corridor, was being proposed to take the density, the height, from 4 stories to 5 stories. 1 additional floor. They've got better graphic skills than even your cartoonist, and you've got a pretty good cartoonist locally. The conversation about density is never easy, but it's got to shift to a conversation about not yes or no, but the quality. My hero, Jonathan Barnett, said it's not how dense you make it, but how you make it dense. He's my hero, but I don't think he's quite right. It's both. The amount of density does matter, but it matters how you do it, how successfully. I want to move the conversation from what I call from NIMBY to Quimby, not a conversation of not in my backyard, which is a yes or no kind of polarized conversation, but Quimby stands for quality in my backyard. How we have a conversation about better design in every context, at every scale, not with a one-size-fits-all approach, but a contextual approach, and all designed really well. So, Mr. Mayor, I'm going to skip through some of these because I've just gone too far. I want to leave you with some initial observations. Forgive me, I know I'm going a little bit over time. Some initial observations. I've gone into much more detail with your staff. I'm going to continue to work with your staff, but a few high-level thoughts for council and for the community. First of all, let's be really clear. Density done well, not just densification as a numbers exercise, but doing it well, is a really critically necessary element to becoming the most sustainable city. If you take that goal seriously, you need to get better at this. You must get better at it. I'm not saying you're horrible at it. I'm saying you need to get better at it. You're not perfectly appropriately positioned to have a successful conversation about density. You don't have the culture, you don't have the conversation, you don't have many of the tools necessary to achieve it. Your staff need additional training and support. You've got an exceptionally good chief planner and a staff that wants to learn, and we're talking about how to build that capacity and skill set and culture into all of your departments, not just the planning department. So there's great potential there, but it's going to take work, it's going to take realization that there needs to be a significant improvement, and you are going to need to support that initiative. It's not going to happen overnight. Sorry. Great city building needs champions. I think the chief planner should be a champion, the mayor should be a chief planner, all of council, community champions. And you need many voices. I fear that there aren't enough voices talking about the different elements of how to build a great city. You've got great voices in your community about heritage preservation. You've got great voices in your community about the issue of tall buildings. You've got probably great voices, but I'm not sure because I haven't heard them, about all the many other elements of why we're talking about densification. Those voices need to be heard better. You need more density, but you also have what I'm calling a big building problem. Just because density is good doesn't mean that any density is good in any context. And I've got concerns for you that some of your proposals that I'm seeing coming through the pipe are too big. Not too tall, but too big. And one of the reasons they might be too big is because you're squashing them because you're so focused on height. It can be a big problem for achieving successful density if you start to say yes to projects that are too big. I'm here to tell you there is such a thing as too much density on a site. It's got to be driven by an urban design exercise. And you've got to have the confidence to say, I don't need to get all my housing on one project or 2 projects. I'm going to have the confidence that I'm going to achieve all of my goals through a pattern of building a better city. You're likely underestimating. Okay, this sentence or this paragraph, Mr. Mayor, is a mouthful. So see if I can get you to follow this. You're likely underestimating how much will need to change to sufficiently improve the culture, system, tools, etc., to deliver successful densification. You're likely underestimating how much you're all going to need to change. It will involve some things you currently don't want to do. I've already heard it in the last 48 hours. There's some things that, I'm not, or that's your staff think you won't let them do as political leaders. It'll take some things that the development industry will tell you that they don't want you to do. It'll take some things that community activists will tell you that they don't want you to do. So there are going to be moments where almost everybody is unhappy. But through that exercise will come better outcomes, because the city will be better as a result of it. I have no doubt of that. The good news is you do have successes in this city. You have remarkable transit successes, walking and biking successes, heritage preservation successes. You've got a lot of assets that other cities that I work for would kill for. And you have good people in key positions. So the opportunity is there for you if you want it. The question just is, how bad do you want it, Mr. Mayor? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So the first, to begin our Q&A, I'm first going to open up the floor to members of council. So anyone in council has a question? Councillor Neal.
Thank you.
Yes, I think it would be great if you could stay at the podium. That would be great.
Thank you for that presentation. It was excellent. I'm wondering if it might be possible to share your slides.
Your staff have them.
That would be great. And if we can make those available
I think the
through our
intention is
public
to put
information
this presentation
websites.
online, and certainly I have no objections to your staff putting my PowerPoint presentation
That's great.
online.
And I'm happy that you recognize the success of our transit system. We're the fastest growing transit system in Ontario, possibly in all of Canada. So that's definitely a success story. And you also recognized heritage. You addressed kind of indirectly the waterfront issue. And one of the great strengths of Kingston is that we're surrounded pretty much by water on 2 or 3 sides. Could you make any comments on development along the waterfront?
I think people following me on Twitter would think that I've been hired specifically to help you with your waterfront, because so many of my tweets, I think I had 2 or 3 of them that were specifically about your waterfront, which as a result of the fact that your staff booked me in a waterfront hotel. You might not do that in the future. But I don't think you have a special problem on your waterfront. I think the waterfront is a great example of the problem you have citywide, which is that you've got the ability, and I think you're making generally good decisions in the places in between that are under city ownership and under control. You've got an evolving waterfront master plan. Hopefully you will make good decisions, including funding around things like cycling infrastructure. But your big challenge right now is how you interact with the development industry. And I don't blame anyone around this table. I'm presuming most of you weren't here for a lot of the things I was looking at on the waterfront. But I point those out not to make myself feel smart. I point those out because they are cautionary tales and instructive lessons on what not to do moving forward, whether it's on the waterfront or not. It's extra heinous in the sense that it's being done in a place that really damages one of your most significant assets, the waterfront. You know, cities would kill for that waterfront. And in some ways, you've damaged that potential, because once those things are built, they're there. But you've also done good things on your waterfront. Your TET Center is remarkable architecture. So then I'm not saying that to you to try to convince you to stop doing that along your waterfront. Hopefully you know that by now. But I'm using it as an example of a conversation and an issue that I believe is a citywide conversation and issue. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Councillor Osterhoff.
Yeah, thanks for being here. That's really, really excellent, and we have a lot to learn from you. You can move here if you want.
My mother would like
Perth
that.
is pretty close. So, any quick suggestions for the university housing and avoiding the monster homes and doing that really well? Because the university is very, very important here, but and also the housing, and how could we do better?
Choices. I think the monster homes are what happens when you do. It's almost a reaction to the absence of a better answer. And so, yes, you're having conversations about other ways to do densification that addresses students in other places so that those neighborhoods could remain more in the way that they have been, both historically and in terms of the perception and culture of the residents. So it's a bit of a cautionary, and I know you folks are struggling with, I know the efforts that have gone in, so I'm not going to be flippant in my answer to you. I know how much effort has gone into this issue. But it's tied to the conversation about densification in general. If you provide more density options, some of that may be taken up by students, some of that may be taken up by millennials if you manage to attract new employers and such to broaden and expand and diversify your economic base, which I know is one of your goals and certainly should be. It can be, that housing can be available for just about anyone. One of the things I like about 2 and 3 bedrooms specifically, in many cities that I work with, my recommendation to council is to require a certain amount of 2 and 3 bedroom units if they're not being built already, because usually in the absence of that requirement, only singles and studios get built, which means you can't get families. My perception is you folks are getting 2 and 3 bedrooms because they're being built for students. And that's almost a bit of a benefit, because the students may be there or not there, but then that housing is available for families too. So it just puts sort of extra pressure on you to have even more units that are 2 and 3 bedroom. So my long-winded answer to your question, Councillor, is it's inextricably connected to the densification conversation in general. Getting your act together with a very coherent strategy about densification is going to do a lot of things for you, including being the better answer on the student housing challenge.
Councillor Holland.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you for the excellent presentation. I guess I'm asking for political advice here, in that we have a large rural component to the city. You've noted the suburbs and the inner city area, or the core of the city, I suppose. I got the point that building the narrative around intensification and the values of it is really important, and of course that's part of our role as councillors and others who work here with the city. But how, I guess, in your experience, have you seen representatives with perhaps a similar breakdown in that we have 12 councillors, 1 mayor, 13 total, and we have only 3 who represent the sort of the core area of the city, and I'm really narrowing that, of course. Yep. So how, like when the issues of tall buildings are coming up and the value of intensification is apparent in certain parts of the city, but perhaps not for others who, I don't agree with this, but perhaps for others who are living in a rural area, for example, where intensification is just so far from their thinking about our city. How do we bring people together and build that consensus that you're talking about?
Oh, by the way, Mr. Mayor, I didn't ask for the protocols. I don't know if you prefer if I use language like through you, Mr. Mayor, or just fine. Respond directly to the councillor? Okay, thank you. Councillor, my first municipal post after 10 years in the private sector here in Ontario was Calgary, which is a unicity, and it includes city and suburb and even some rural or pseudo-rural. So I understand your challenge. My observation then, because I was pseudo-political in the sense that my ability to achieve my goals as a planner was completely dependent on the perspective of the council about the shared obligation and responsibilities. So I spent a lot of time working with my rural councillors and my suburban councillors to understand the critical importance of a successful downtown and inner city to them and their constituents, whether they ever come downtown. One of my narratives is, and I hope this is, I don't even need to say this in a city like Kingston, but often I do, is whether a suburban resident or voter ever comes downtown, hopefully they understand that the health and success of that downtown is critically important to them. It's important to the tax base. It's where much of the tax base gets generated, so even if you're just motivated by that. But telling that story, I found often that the inner city and the urban parts of the city are not particularly good at telling that story as part of the political narrative. And it shouldn't be all to the downtown or inner city councillors to tell that story. That should be a city story that is constantly done. My only political advice to you is empower your staff. I believe firmly, I was a chief planner and I was very outspoken. I understand and believe in the power of the chief planner being out in the community as an outspoken champion and facilitator of this conversation, to be able to go out and have the information, tell the stories, celebrate the successes, talk candidly about the challenges. About that kind of thing. Tell the truth when it's issues like that the suburbanites benefit from the tax base of the inner city. Show the numbers. And make that case with your council colleagues. And hopefully you don't have to. Any suburban councillors and such, if they don't understand yet how they are, you're all in this together, just don't have the facts. But often that can honestly be the case. The facts haven't been well communicated. Almost every second question you ask me, Council, my part of my answer will probably be communicate better. Celebrate your successes, tell your stories better.
Councillor Stroud.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you, Mr. Toderian. Is it Toderian? Is that correct?
That's how it's spelled, so you're not wrong in that sense. My family pronounces it Toderian.
Toderian. So Commissioner Hurdle was pronouncing it correctly. I have an Armenian friend who has a similar name, and it's, yeah, anyways. Thank you, Toderian, Mr. Toderian. That was a very fascinating presentation, and I'm very excited that you're here. I've been following you on Twitter for a while, and I'm familiar with the concept of urbanism and the different kinds of urbanism, and I see now that you have your own style, I guess. You said it was advanced urbanism. So we're obviously, none of us are there yet in a place like Kingston, but thanks to your presentation, we can hopefully get there. I have an issue, a specific question that illustrates what Councillor Holland was just mentioning and also illustrates what you were saying about the narrative and how we need to change the narrative. And it's related to induced demand, but in a specific sense. We actually have a project on the books right now that is not, the green light isn't completely there, but it's considered pretty much a done deal. It's going to happen, and it's because the narrative starts with it being an assumption. And the narrative started like this. A private developer has obtained some land in our downtown, and they're planning on building there. We're not sure exactly what they're going to build, but we're losing some parking spaces. So the narrative was put to us by the CAO. We are losing so many parking spaces from our parking supply. They need to be replaced. We suggest a parking garage on this spot. And so that's what we're debating. We're debating where to put the parking garage. And it's sort of a given that we're going to build the parking garage because we've lost this parking supply and it has to be replaced. That's the assumption. From your presentation, I'm getting the impression that that's in your list of 4 ways to do things. Do the wrong thing better, trying to have your cake and eat it too, and to do the right thing. That's either number 1 or number 2, I think, from your presentation.
Well, there might be a 5th one, Councillor, which is not doing the right thing better, not doing things better. It doesn't make things worse. I've literally worked and seen cities that would see that as an opportunity to double the amount of surface parking. So that would be making it even worse. But I'm probably not disagreeing with any of your staff colleagues by pointing out the obvious, which is that your staff take direction from you. The conversation about whether or not you quote-unquote need parking is a strategic conversation relative to the mode shift intentions you have for how people will get downtown. Parking supply is an incredibly important lever in the conversation that I'm having with you about multimodal urbanism. Road capacity is an important lever, and parking supply is a very important lever. In Vancouver and in other cities, the amount of absolute parking, surface or not, we've been trending down deliberately. That is the strategy. If that's an interest for council, you can have that conversation. I don't know enough about your parking situation to know whether that's a good idea, right or not. But it's a question I always ask. Do we want to have, there's going to be pressure from your public to say, well, and from your downtown businesses, I don't need to tell you, are going to say we need more parking downtown. There's one thing I get from every downtown business association I've ever worked with. Well, the problem is there's not enough parking. That's usually not the problem. Often the problem is there's too much parking and not enough things there to actually happen. But You can't have a knee-jerk reaction to that. That's a great question to ask, which becomes the basis of an analysis and a community conversation, etc. And I don't know the answer to it. But I've never seen, one of my lines is every great place has a parking problem. And you often make the great place worse by trying to solve the parking problem.
So we need to consider more than just possibly replacing the parking supply, I guess. Other options.
If the answer is to put it underground, there's opportunities for that. I don't know your seismic or your structural issues associated with that. The question is, the worst kind of parking in a downtown from the success of a downtown is surface parking. So if you're replacing it, but you're replacing it structured or downtown, that's actually an improvement. But the better answer is asking yourself, do we need that parking at all? And what is the strategic relationship between providing that parking and our mode shift goals relative to how people are getting downtown? I've got my meeting with your active transport staff tomorrow, so I don't know enough to make an intelligent comment. But I'm going to be asking them questions like, do you have a target? Do you have a mode shift goal for yourself? What is your existing situation with the trips and relative percentages, and have you set a target? And then have you asked yourself what it would take to actually achieve that target? And I guarantee you one of the parts of that answer is thinking about your parking supply.
Councillor Senek.
Thank you. I found it really interesting when you were saying that in Vancouver, the most predominant built form is mid-rise. And so I just
probably actually low-rise, Councillor. I was probably wrong. But there's a lot more mid-rise than there is high-rise, would be a better way to put it.
Okay, so my question is that what you're recommending Kingston to do as well? And in Vancouver, when you say that, what range of number of stories is that? Because maybe 16 stories is considered mid-rise in Vancouver, where for us in Kingston, that's considered high-rise. So I just want to get the right context.
It's not quite that bad, Councillor. But you're right. What's mid-rise, what's medium scale is relative. What I always said when I was chief planner there was mid-rise was between 4 and 10 stories. But what I said is what most people think of as mid-rise was the sort of 4 to 6 to 7 stories. The way I put it now, actually, is mid-rise is what can be fit appropriately into a well-designed podium. And you don't have a 10-story podium. If anyone ever proposes to you a 10-story podium, don't approve it. That's too tall for a podium. So if it's higher than you would ever do a podium, then it's probably not mid-rise. Okay. But that varies even by our context in Vancouver. You know, a 10-story building would be short in our downtown. A 10-story in one of our neighborhood centers would probably be reasonably tall and would be referred to as a tower. So it varies even within a city.
Thank you.
Deputy Mayor Bohm.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you. Thanks again for your presentation. Obviously, I've yet to run into somebody that's not really aware of the buzzword intensification. Also, most people seem to be in favor of it. The biggest thing that I find seems to be how we do it. So you mentioned kind of the short, squished, squat buildings, which tend to be a result of the high-rises kind of getting squished down and trying to get that same level of density. So in Kingston, is it possible that we're kind of at this conundrum simply because there's been some prior examples of just tall, too big, block buildings, and then the path after that was, okay, well, we'll just sort of squish them down. And then we sort of have this kind of short, squat, ugly building as opposed to a tall, massive, ugly building. So knowing that we're a city that really values our heritage, how do we reconcile maintaining our heritage, getting some variances in height, because obviously not all high-rises are bad, but they need to be architecturally beautiful, as well as getting the right density mix? And I know you mentioned towers and then certain podiums and everything, and you also touched on streetscape and no blank walls, and I think those are all valid points. How do we bring that all together?
That's a complex question.
And if you could answer that in less than 4 words.
Yeah, sure. Yes. I've done work in extremely sensitive heritage contexts like Gastown in Vancouver, which is a national heritage site. The answer in Gastown is no towers are allowed. But immediately around Gastown, towers are allowed. And the debate about whether you should be able to see towers from Gastown, which I know is a debate here, should you be able to see towers from Market Square? The answer is yes, you can see towers from Gastown. But the conversation is about, is the tower you can see a big, fat, ugly tower, to put it crassly? Or is it an elegant... I can show you pictures of Gastown, which are beautiful towers with beautiful historic streetscape with towers in the background. But because of the nature of the towers don't draw your eye and detract from your ability to enjoy the nature of the heritage context you're in. So you can... But should you put towers right on Water Street, which is our main spine in our heritage district? No, absolutely not. So I think there can be a conversation, as I say, about where and where not. And the important thing in that sentence is the where not. Because you're actually providing clarity for the community, for the developers who you don't want to buy sites and then consolidate sites and overpay for land and then get the bad news you're not going to support their tower, because they're just going to make your life really hard. You want to tell them before they even do that, where and where not. My sense right now is you're not there yet, because you will entertain a plan in a place where height wasn't necessarily contemplated. So that sends the message to the marketplace, well, the current plan doesn't allow it, but I'll put effort into consolidating and I'll roll the dice. And by the way, I'm talking about a plan, not the zoning. One thing for the community to really understand, I often hear from the community, the zoning doesn't allow that, and that should be the answer. You should respect your zoning. The legal and real truth of zoning is zoning can be changed. It's the whole zoning system in Ontario and Canada and everywhere I've done zoning is a whole system is predicated on the assumption that there can and probably will be applications to change zoning. Zoning is not your vision. Zoning is the identification of the status quo. It's what's currently allowed. What matters is your plan. What matters is the plan that guides and instructs staff when they get an application to change zoning. That may sound like semantics, but it's actually really important. Because it puts pressure on you to provide more clarity in your plan. And then if the community comes in and says, how dare you change the zoning, folks, zoning changes all the time. The whole legal system has been based on the actual legal principle that council is required to consider zoning applications. And you're supposed to consider it in the context of your plan. So the plan is what's really important in this context. Sorry for that aside, but that's an important distinction. It puts pressure on you to get the plan right and to provide the clarity and the answers within your plan.
So just to kind of follow that up, it sounds like we need to start a larger conversation of where we would have low, medium, and high-rise buildings.
That's
because,
right.
as you mentioned, everything's appropriate, but it's got to be in the right spot with the right fit.
In the historic core, well, actually, the epicenter of the historic core, what's your answer? In the rest of the historic core, what's your answer? And it doesn't have to be a yes or no. It can be here and here and here, but not everywhere else. You can be that specific. In the rest of what you call the downtown, which is actually a remarkably big geographic area that I had to wrap my mind around, what's the answer there? And then in the rest of the city, the where and where not specifically identified in those various contexts, and then the how. And a lot of conversation about the how. What is a good tower? What is a good podium? What is a good ground plane treatment? What are your expectations, and what are you clearly going to say no to if they come in with something that doesn't meet your expectations? All of that, the development industry doesn't necessarily always remember this, but all of that is actually important for the development industry because it provides clarity that actually allows them to price land properly. One of your jobs and staff's job is to send enough clarity out there into the marketplace that developers don't overpay for land. One of your big challenges is when there's a kind of a unclear message sent, a willingness to entertain something in a context where it shouldn't be provided, and then that sends the message to the next developer, well, go ahead and pay those high prices because you'll get the density. You know, part of your job is to send clear messages out to the marketplace so that they can make smart decisions. And by the way, if they make dumb decisions, if they overpay for land even though you've been clear, that's their problem. That's called speculation, right?
So, thank you.
Councillor-
But if you've sent, notwithstanding the applause, if the city and planners, and I always felt this pressure, if we sent mixed messages, then it's our problem. Because can I really blame them for overpaying for land? They didn't know what the land was worth.
Councillor Turner.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation tonight. It was amazing. You shared a lot of very interesting things. I'm a West End councillor, and a lot of the people in my district drive their cars. So I'm one of those bad people where people drive their cars, and they complain a lot that there's not enough parking downtown. So in terms of parking, I understand surface parking is not a good thing, and I agree we do need a different facility for parking. But what my concern is as our population ages, how will these people get around with mobility issues? And that concerns me about a city, and how will they do that? If you could answer that, that would be great.
Two things, Councillor, and I know you were kidding, so I'm not picking on your language, but people who drive cars are not bad people. One of my comments is, if we design a community that's car dependent, and we tell everybody they should walk, bike, and take public transit more, is that reasonable? In many cases, I don't own a car. Not because I'm an ideologue who thinks cars are bad, but I live in a place where owning a car is dumb. It's actually a hindrance to my life. That's the way the environment has been designed. Other environments are designed where all options are open. It's not necessarily a hindrance, but I also have the choice to walk, bike, or take public transit as well as owning a car. And a lot of citizens in cities where the density's been done well are multimodal citizens. They do own a car. They just don't feel the need to use it for every trip. And that I actually think is the goal. I'm not here to vilify drivers. As I say, I've had thousands of people in my career to explain to me why their life necessitates a car. Aging population, kids in ballet and hockey. There's all sorts of different scenarios. My message is there's nothing in my narrative that says you should be forced out of your car. My narrative is I want you to be able to drive your kids to ballet but walk to the grocery store if you want. I want there to be choices in the way we've designed your neighborhood so that you have more freedom. And you may or may not choose to drive a car. You may live in an urban place and still drive your car every single time, and no police cop is going to give you a ticket for that. But I want the environment to be able to facilitate those choices. And again, for those who have to do it or just really want to and don't want to change, it's a benefit to them if all their neighbors have choices that mean they're not competing for that finite space on the street. But let's be clear, what we've been building and what you've been building, except what you originally inherited in the urban pattern of the inner city, doesn't come close to achieving that. Your suburbs are car dependent. You don't have those choices.
I agree. I know it's very difficult. I'm just worried about them as they age, how they're going to get from A to B. And I know there's accessible buses and stuff, but it's
which
just
is
my
why
concern.
my point about the baby boomers looking now for urban places. There's an increasing narrative that says the suburbs are no place to grow old.
Oh, I know.
Because as soon as you lose, my mother and her husband are facing this, as soon as you, for health reasons, or can no longer drive or shouldn't be driving, you're suddenly isolated, you're vulnerable, you're dependent. So that's why we're having a conversation about more choice. Everything you've said about the aging population reinforces my message.
Councillor Candon.
Thank you, and through you. Another question related to parking. I'm not sure why everyone's asking about parking, but is there a best practices that you're seeing either in the province or in the country or globally related to parking ratios? So for example, if you build a 200-unit building, a lot of times people are saying you have to have 200 parking spaces. The concern I have when we talk about affordability is that a lot of places are selling parking for, say, $40,000. If they didn't have a car, or we didn't force them to buy that parking space for their unit, they could have a much more affordable unit, and then it kind of pushes people into that concept of living, say, downtown and walking everywhere, or using public transit. Is there a best practices that you see emerging?
Councillor, there's not a best practice in terms of a number. in my observation. There's a best practice in terms of approaches. I think the best practice is to look at parking contextually. You know, I'll give you an example. Along transit corridors, you should be thinking about a different parking standard. Where you don't have a place for illegal parking to occur, like in Vancouver's case, the downtown, you can lower the parking standard and not worry about a problem because people won't buy a car and park it in the neighborhood illegally because there's no place to park it. So you have a confidence that you're able to provide a housing option for people who truly don't want to own a car. But that's a contextual thing. So in some urban places, we worry about there being parking problems in the adjacent neighborhood, if those adjacent neighborhoods don't exist for various reasons, or you can manage that concern through a management structure for parking passes, etc., then you don't worry about it. How your parking expectations trend down over time is key. One of the things that Vancouver has done has been always very strategic about looking at where the market is and helping the market go down in a fast evolution but not a revolution way. Every couple of years we've lowered the parking standard. And so you're helping the market trend down. But at the same time, we're making sure we're providing the options, the alternatives. The transit is there, the walking is there, the biking is there, at the same time as we're trending down the parking. And over 10 years, suddenly you wake up and you have half or a quarter of the parking you used to have. But none of that was like that, but it was very deliberate and strategic in terms of its trending down. Decoupling parking is a key best practice. If you haven't done that already, you should look at that. The idea should be that you mandate that developers sell the parking space separately, because you don't want people who don't want to own a car to have to buy the parking space. You want them to make that as a choice, which means you can often provide less parking in the project and you achieve an affordability goal because people have the option to not buy the parking space and save them $35,000 to $40,000. That's another best practice. You know, so parking maximums are a best practice in certain contexts where you've got a problem where no matter what your minimum is, the developer is going to build 3 times that. And you have to start to think about a maximum to make sure that they don't keep overbuilding. An example being on transit areas where, notwithstanding the actual transit support, the successful densification, they're still overbuilding parking, which makes it very hard to get people to consider the transit ridership option. And so a parking maximum is often appropriate. Another conversation that's happening right now is every city's being told by urbanists like me to get rid of their parking minimum and let people build parking projects with no parking. And we're celebrating individual projects in different cities that have 0 parking. That's an option in the right context. In a context where you've got multimodal opportunities, you can try that out and see how the market responds. And you have a confidence that you're not going to have an adjacent parking problem in the next neighborhood. What I say that is slightly different is I wouldn't get rid of your parking minimum. I would do what we deliberately did in Vancouver, which is use the parking minimum as an incentive to achieve something you want. It's kind of like a version of density bonusing. Density is good, but you still don't give density away. You use density to leverage the things that make that density successful, right? Similarly, if you reduce your parking, say you set a low parking standard, but there's still a minimum, but it's low, but you can provide an option for the developer to get down to 0 parking if they provide on-site car sharing, additional bike facilities, investment in adjacent cycling infrastructure, or what have you, things that you're struggling with that you can't, through regulation, require them to do. An incentive like that in Vancouver, where you could trade, for every car share space they provided, you can reduce parking by 5. I think you've got that. That's been so successful in Vancouver that Vancouver is by far the North American leader in car share use, because every single private sector project for the last 20 years has car share embedded in it. And you can't swing a stick without hitting a car share option, which is an incredibly powerful way to be able to reduce your parking standard. Because what's true in high-density urbanism is you can have transit, walking, and biking, but people will still own a car and leave it parked downstairs for the proverbial weekend trip to IKEA or the trip to the Blue Mountains or whatever it is, even though that's an expensive thing sitting there most of the time. But as soon as you show them that they could get a car share membership, then you go from a low car use scenario to a no car ownership scenario, which has benefits from the parking you build, the affordability of the units, et cetera, et cetera. So car share is a very, very strategic thing. We achieved our car share success by leveraging the parking minimum in order to achieve it, which is why I always tell urbanists, don't give anything away for free. Find a way to leverage it to achieve the things that you're not able to leverage or achieve as a council.
I have a follow-up question. So I would be willing to hedge my bets that your presentation tonight has caught the attention of everyone in the room, or most people in the room, I would say. I should never say everyone, but you know, when we leave here today and we go to work tomorrow, what are our first steps? Like, how do we go from having a conversation that seems to be just obsessed with height to a more sophisticated conversation that has to do with all the things you're speaking about? If we were to implement your theories, what does tomorrow morning look like? What are we doing?
Well, tomorrow morning I'm spending with your staff. You know, the answer is slightly different for every participant in this process. I would hope that this starts a conversation in the community that might evolve the approach and narrative and conversation of everything from heritage activists to community activists to those very interested in density. And by the way, I don't use activists as a bad word. Activists are just people who care passionately about something. And some of you may say to me, well, Brent, you really oversimplified us. We don't just think about height. We do this, that, and the other thing. So I might be potentially unfair in the way I've characterized this. I don't know. But I want this to be a start of a conversation where community activists are thinking about how they engage into this conversation. I know that staff are in the process of a transformation. They were in the process of a transformation before this week and my arrival. I'm part of facilitating what they've already been starting, and hopefully I can hit the gas on it, no pun intended. But I already know that there's progress being made, and it started with some of the decisions you made about who to put in charge of planning and such. From council's perspective, you're going to need to support your staff, because there's going to be pushback. There's going to be blowback. And when the resistance pushes back, and some of it might be right, some of it may be wrong, and you're going to listen very carefully. But at the end of the day, what you would be asking your staff to do is very hard, and they're going to need your support. And they're going to need it most when the angry calls come from the developers or from the community activists, or both. You might have a phone on both ears. But when that tough moment comes, I spend a lot of my times with councils preparing councils for those tough moments, because nothing I'm talking about is uncontroversial. There's no way. I can give you advice on a lot of things, but I can't give you advice on how to densify with no controversy. I haven't seen that yet. I don't think it exists. But are you doing a good job in the context of that controversy? Do you have credibility in that controversy? Do you have, I call it, do you have the high ground? Because you're basically confident that you're doing good and right things, and you know why you're doing them.
Thank you.
Does that help?
Very good, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So now we're going to move to round 2 of the Q&A. So at this point, I'm going to open up to members of the public that are here tonight. So as I said before, the first thing I'm going to ask is just one question per person. As we open up the floor, it's already getting close to 8 o'clock, so I just want to make sure as many people as possible have a chance to ask a question. Just raise your hand, and when I point you out, then we'll go from there. Yes, sir.
My name is Eric Karstens. I live at 165 Ontario Street. I'm sorry, I have a cold. First of all, I would like to thank the mayor and the councillors very much for organizing this meeting and allowing us all to come and to listen to this presentation, and to also form what I think is a very, very encouraging population who's concerned about what's happening in Kingston. So I congratulate you and thank you very much, Mayor. I have a question. Kingston, in my opinion, has a lot of high-density or high-rise building, which is based on kind of a cookie-cutter formula. You take a platform and you say, how many stories can I build on top of that platform? What can I get away with? And I've had discussions with a couple of different architects in town about how ugly their buildings are. How does one encourage, or how should we try to encourage architecturally beautiful buildings? And is there really a dramatic difference in cost between an ugly building and a beautiful building? Thank you.
One of my key messages is that beauty shouldn't be more expensive. Usually when price gets added to developments, it's in the context of the price point they're going after. So it's more about the granite countertops than it is about the kind of civic beauty I'm talking about. There are ways, materials have more of an effect on the cost of a project than some of the things that I'm talking about, which is good street relationship, right? There can be I've seen low-cost public sector buildings, public housing, that are some of the best buildings in an urban pattern I've seen in the context of what I'm talking about, because they treat the street well, they're rightly scaled, and they have some architectural interest that can be as cheap as a can of paint. So the conversation, I actually left out a series of slides because I was worried I'd gone very over time right at the end with the mayor, but actually, can I show them really quick? There. One of the things I do on Twitter is I use a hashtag called #City of Smiles. All the different things that happen, often for the price of a can of paint. And I'm not saying deface your historic buildings with paint in the next 5 minutes, folks, but this kind of open-mindedness that can be facilitated by city or not around surprise and joy and what I call a city of smiles. I think cities can facilitate that, or at the least get out of the way and let your creative community do it. Every blank wall to me is a canvas with an opportunity. Beauty can be as simple as that. I don't need an architecture shaped like Marilyn Monroe to feel like I've achieved beauty. And probably none of you can afford a building a home in that building anyway, because the price point will be too high. What I'm talking about in terms of beauty is very different. The kind of interaction in public life on the street, as simple as taking some of your parking spaces and making them public spaces. I'm a big fan of container urbanism, the idea of taking your gaps in your urban pattern that are waiting for development that might not happen and activating it with something simple and lively and not at all expensive, as you can see. And if you think that, cities with no standards do this, that's Helsinki, that's New York, that's Copenhagen, that's Oslo, that's Christchurch, addressing all the buildings that got knocked down in the earthquake, and that's your peer city of Halifax on the waterfront as they wait for the waterfront to transform. So rich cities are doing this. This isn't something that cities that can't afford better do. They're doing it because it's smart, and food trucks and containers and such. To me, my definition of beauty is about public life. It's not about a building shaped like Maryland. Does that help?
Yes, sir. Oh, well, if we can just wait just for a microphone to come over, just so that everyone can hear the question.
Thank you. My question is similar to the last one about beauty, or about good design, really. But I mean, how do you define that? You're just answering part of that there, but how do administrators make those kinds of judgments? I think that's real tough. I think that's a real tough number to.
I don't think administrators do. When I was chief planner of Vancouver, technically I had authority over almost everything built in the city, but I often pointed out that I don't oversee public art, because is a city official going to tell Monet to put a little more blue in the water lilies? You don't. There has to be a creative opening that is encouraged by the city, that isn't administered by the city. But it could be as simple from an administration perspective as I've recommended to cities that they do an inventory of every blank wall in their downtown, document them, put them in a booklet and then open it up to the community and say, these are the places where you can be creative. Or maybe you get them to submit proposals or something like that. But you're letting creative people be creative. And by the way, can I just go back and answer, first part of your question was about cookie cutter. And I want to say that part of this exercise is you're going to have to be willing to push back on the cookie cutter and say, I know that's the way you've done your last 5 buildings elsewhere or in our city, but this is what we expect you to do. And you have to be willing to say no. But my observation is that the cities that are confident enough to say no get good development. They don't really scare off development. That's a pretty lazy narrative, and it works when councils and cities frankly lack confidence. But the cities that are getting better have set a high standard. And can I tell you just one quick anecdote? When I was in Calgary, it was a very pro-private sector, the market knows best, development or City Hall should get out of the way. And one of the ways I convinced the politicians to raise the bar and expect more was I showed them examples of projects that were being done by developers in Calgary, where those developers were also building things in Vancouver and San Francisco and Boston, and there was a demonstrated obvious difference. And what I said is the only variable that's different is the expectations that we have and the message we've sent about what we're willing to live with. So a lot of this is about your confidence to expect more. And if you're clear about it, you won't scare off development. I haven't seen a place that does. And if you do, you're scaring off the bad development anyway. And you're opening up the opportunity of, I know scenarios where bad developers, because of this, have sold their land to good developers, and you get a good project. Sorry, I jumped back to the first question because I forgot that was a meaty piece to talk about. But
okay, I'm going to go back. I'm just going to go back and forth. So I'm going to go back to this side. Yes, ma'am.
Thanks. Well, I'll just join the chorus of praise. Thank you very much for that talk. My name's Christine Sipnowicz. I just wanted to say that there's much to admire about Vancouver, but Vancouver's made mistakes too,
sure.
right? And speculation, which has driven up the cost of housing. The record of heritage conservation, I think, there's been a lot of distress about the loss of the heritage fabric of that city as buildings are demolished to build towers, mid-rises, monster homes, etc. And I guess I wonder whether there's also a key factor that's different between the two cities, Kingston versus Vancouver, and that is Vancouver's had huge exponential growth. Kingston has very, very slow growth. And of course, we want to invite employers to boost that, but we also have to recognize that. And something also that's really wonderful about Kingston is that we still have managed to hold on to a lot of our heritage buildings. And I think that's really crucial. And I think we have to, I really would hope that we take your advice and counsel and think very carefully about the context of Kingston. Kingston is special, has special features, special characteristics. I mean, I must say that I was heartened by some of the advice you were giving, because it really did suggest that not only have we made mistakes in the past, but we are right now doing mistakes, and we should stop doing them. We should put a halt to, for example, mega bridges like the Third Crossing that are just going to exponentially raise the amount of car use in this city. We should say no to the slab high-rises that are coming into the historic downtown. We should say no to the Capitol building, which is going to deface a historic building in the center of the downtown with a 16-story building. So I really hope that those conversations that you're having with staff and our city...
Ma'am, I'm just going to ask you to get to the question.
Embolden our council and our staff to say no. So I hope you talk about some of the concrete particulars of Kingston itself, not just the general principles that are imported from Vancouver.
Well, thank you, ma'am. To be clear, let's be really, really clear if I haven't been completely clear. I'm not coming here telling you to do what Vancouver did. It's been almost 6 years since I was chief planner. I've worked in 100 cities since. My message is never to do what some other city did. My message is to learn from the principles of successful cities and apply those principles to your context, because those principles are universal. If you're distracted by how tall our Vancouver buildings are, or the different climate, or the affordability crisis we have in Vancouver, then it takes your eye off the inherent truth of the principles I'm talking about, which after doing this for a long time, over 26 years, and working all over the world, I've recognized are universal. You know, geometry of how many cars you fit in a city is the same no matter where you are. Kingston is a unique city, but unique in the context of every snowflake is unique. But every snowflake is still a snowflake. None of them are coffee makers. So what I always point out is cities have more in common with each other than differences. And you can learn from cities of every scale. And it's quite common for me to get commentary that sort of says, well, but we're different than Vancouver. Of course you are. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that just like Vancouver can learn from Kingston, Kingston can learn from Vancouver. Your point about Vancouver being far from perfect, hell yeah. I agree completely, and there's a reason why I struggled for 6 years, because there are big challenges in Vancouver. What I give Vancouver credit for is the incredible push to solve those problems, to do better proactively and not just let market forces and such provide the answer for us. Vancouver is a very deliberate city. Planning is valued. Urban design is valued. The vision is valued, and that translates into better outcomes, notwithstanding the fact that Vancouver still has massive challenges.
Okay, over on this side. Yes, just in the front, the second row, but the middle of the second row there.
Thank you and welcome to Kingston. I heard your radio program on CBC this morning and I was very disheartened that you had such a horrible view from your hotel window. I live in 33 Ontario Street, which is named the Shipyards. It is a 5-story building with two-story apartments above, so that if you call that a 6-story building. It has a frontage of about 280 feet, step-walked. It has underground parking, and it houses 156 units. It was built in 1974, not yesterday, but it would be nice to see similar buildings of a similar size and height on our waterfront. Right now, our building is being faced with a 20-story building with proposed 292 units, and it's going to ruin the view of the people that live on the water side of this building. I'd like it stopped.
So is there a question? Is there a question, ma'am?
Yes, what can we do to stop it besides? Or is it already carved in stone?
To be clear to everyone in the audience, I'm going to make no comment about specific proposals. Neither infrastructure proposals like the bridge, which I've heard a lot and I've got emails about the bridge, but I don't know enough about the context to make an informed opinion, and I'm not lazy. I don't make opinions public unless they are informed opinions. So I'm not going to comment on any proposal. I don't doubt the veracity of your description of the situation, but I just don't know enough to comment. I'm putting out principles and ideas and truths about different forms and different approaches in different contexts, always with good design, that I'm hoping will help you as you evolve in the sophistication of your own conversation about these things. That's my goal. My goal is to help you get better at this, to be more credible in the conversation about this, everyone to be more credible, to be more factual, to be more constructively candid about things, to get past some of the baggage, because I do believe there is dogma and baggage associated with some things, but also to be truthful when past mistakes have been made and talk about those constructively so that you can move forward and do better in the future. I believe in that.
Okay, I'm going to move back over to the other side. And again, just a reminder, questions only, please. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name's Duncan McDowell. I'd like to reiterate thanks to the council and your honor for this evening. It is very refreshing to come to something that's not confrontational and oppositional. An excellent talk. I think it suggests to me that we have to step back perhaps from some of the immediate challenges before us and reframe some of our dialogue, get away from a car-oriented, etc. So thank you for this evening. A question for our excellent speaker. I'm a British Columbian and as proud of Vancouver as perhaps you are. I suggest that maybe there's one element you should add into your criteria of successful sustained development, and that is social equitability. As you pointed out, Vancouver is horrendously expensive. There's a now famous op-ed piece by the young millennial last fall in Vancouver who moved to Calgary because she couldn't afford to live there, titled, "I didn't leave Vancouver, Vancouver left me." What worries me about much of what I see about densification here is that it tends to be dedicated to high-end rental, high-end condos, pushing out a more balanced downtown. And I think we have to ask that question about social equitability and not just predicated on perhaps a developmental strategy that is geared to who has the money. Thank you for your presentation.
Because I started to speed up at the end of my presentation, I really went fast over that third element of density done well, which is about amenities and diversity. And a couple of truths. Vancouver is at least the most expensive city in Canada. I often say it's a result of success in the context of you build something good, people want to be a part of it. And in the absence of a cataclysmic event, it's going to stay expensive. But Vancouver does more than any other city in North America to aggressively intervene in the marketplace to try to address the affordability challenge. It is a daily intense conversation and debate. And there is always a conversation about who the density is for. Is it for families? Is it for quote-unquote locals? There's all sorts of conversations. Some have gotten very nasty and even accused of racism. There's all sorts of different tensions. As I say, if you think our conversations about density are easy, but all the things that I'm talking about apply in the context of any kind of city, a rich city, a poor city, a city that struggles with affordability because it's so quote-unquote successful, another city that's struggling just to make something happen. I spent my first 10 years of my career working in cities like Kitchener-Waterloo at the time, where we were trying to make something happen in the downtown because the downtown was, in many cases, perceived as almost empty. So the principles that I'm talking about are things that apply to different conditions, and that's why I keep them at a fairly high level. Your job as locals, and I'm glad to help if you want me to, is to figure out how those translate into better practices, better policy, better culture, and better conversations here. But I completely agree with you that social diversity and equity is part of my third element, and it's a very important part in terms of not just seniors housing, affordable housing, disabled housing, universal accessibility, equity, etc. Critical component of the conversation.
Okay, back over on this side, just towards the back, just on the aisle. Yes, sir, in the striped shirt. We'll just wait for the mic, please.
Thank you very much. I found this really enlightening, and it's nice to see things going in a bit of a different direction. My name's David, and I own a little shop called Martello Alley. It's brand new. It's only about 2 years old in downtown Kingston. And about 70% of the people who come into our shop are tourists. We don't get a lot of locals in our place because I guess we're too new or whatever. But it tends to be a tourist type of shop. And for me, it's critical that because of all the tourists we have, and they come here because of our beautiful historic downtown, it's critical that we maintain that, and if we build new developments, that they blend in and they don't detract. And I was really quite shocked and surprised pleasantly that you tweeted out those pictures and those comments about your hotel view. I agree 100%, and a lot of the people coming into the store have, because I talk to the people and I interact with them, and many of those people coming in from outside say, what a beautiful downtown, but what happened to the waterfront? Why did they do that? And I can't answer that question. So thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Now, moving forward, I know that with new developments, there are going to be these trade-offs for higher density and whatever, or for setbacks or whatever accommodations, and they're called community benefits. And correct me if I'm wrong, I'm directing this, I guess, at our city planning department. It seems that when we're looking at these community benefits and trade-offs, we're talking about dollars, and we're taking out calculators and measuring tape. We're not talking about creativity. We're not talking about the experience that the shoppers and the visitors are having when they're coming to our downtown. So we're still going to end up with the same bland kind of thing. Now, in the context of
question,
please. The question is, how do we inject creativity? How can we get more input before all the final designs are made? And, instead of just talking about measuring. How can we make something more beautiful and creative? How can we do that in the context of what we have?
So this is typically a question and answer time for Mr. Toderian. So why don't we do this? Why don't we give Mr. Toderian an opportunity to respond to anything, and then if Ms. Agnew would like to add anything, she can.
Mr. Mayor, if you are okay with it, I love any opportunity. One of my goals is to actually help facilitate a culture where your chief planner and you really know each other really well, and that your chief planner, I think, who has all the ability and chops in terms of the last 2 days we've talked about to do, and is already working on many of the things I'm talking about. I actually encourage the opportunity for Paige to be a part of this conversation with me. I'll say you and I have shared some emails back and forth. You've shared with me some incredibly detailed emails, incredibly detailed. And I don't disagree, but although I have a very high standard for the public realm edge condition of new buildings, very few buildings are going to end up looking like your context, because your context is pretty darn special. But I agree with you that the quality of that edge condition at eye level is critically important, and even in the good examples that you and I talked about by email, even if it's good, we tend to do it in a monotonous way. A new project has the sameness go along. Instead of establishing an idea of a rhythm and an individuality of storefronts, which I've seen is entirely possible in the context of new developments. You can't do it in a fake, themey kind of way. I wouldn't want to try to duct tape on a copy of your frontage onto a new project. It's just not authentic, and I do believe authenticity is an important thing. But you can create a sense of differentiation so you're not bored to death as you're a pedestrian walking along. Because blank walls are the worst, but active walls that are boring aren't necessarily great either. Paige, did you want to? Oh, sorry, Mr. Mayor.
Ms. Agnew?
Thank you, and through you, Mayor Patterson. So I would say when it comes to community benefits, and there's a number of people in the room that have worked very closely with my staff. Greg Newman on my staff has been leading the community benefit conversation with the city for the last 12 months or so, and we have discussed that with Brent in particular, and we're having another discussion with him tomorrow. And what I can say in terms of the guideline that we've developed going forward with respect to community benefits is cutting edge. It's cutting edge with any other major urban center, and we really took time to look at best practices from other municipalities that are really doing it well and have been doing it well for a long time. What Kingston has lacked in this conversation related to community benefits over the last year or so is the fact that we just didn't have the experience of going through multiple projects and knowing how to do it well. So we have gone through a community conversation related to a specific development proposal that some people found frustrating because the community benefits conversation came in later on in the project, and what we're aiming to do on a go-forward basis is to have those conversations at the very beginning of projects, at the front end of projects, where there's a great opportunity to engage in a truly collaborative community-based conversation that looks at not just assessing what the value is. In assessing the value, it is a mathematical piece, and it is an important piece of understanding the value associated with the density that the city is proposing to support. But it doesn't mean that it has to come at the expense of creativity and what the community benefits can be. So again, going forward, we're working on finalizing that guideline. It is a really good, robust guideline. I think it's going to provide us with a much better tool as a community, and that as we work together as a community, every project that we look at going forward where we're negotiating community benefits, we're going to be seeing much better results than what I think the city's been able to achieve in the past.
Mr. Mayor, if I could quickly add, just because the conversation or question mentioned community benefits, to say something that I really would like to say, and I suspect Paige probably feels she can't say, although maybe she can moving forward. Here's how you can help. There is going to be a conversation about community benefits. It's going to end up at council. Community benefits, density bonusing as the tool for achieving community benefits, as I said, is an incredibly powerful tool for better city making. Right now, the developers are calling your councillors and saying, don't do it. They don't want you to do it. And some of you, as activists, are accusing the city of wanting to sell density because you don't like how tall the building is or how big it is. You're saying, well, the city's just doing that to get community benefits. And language like selling density or deal making instead of plan making is being used. That's familiar to me because I get that in Vancouver. Whenever the community doesn't like the level of density, it can be about, well, you're just doing it to get community benefits. Your staff understands what I know, which is the first stage of a community benefit process is to get the density right, the design right. You never let the community benefit wag the dog, if you know the tail wagging the dog metaphor. And once you've got the density right, then you do the math on the community benefits and you achieve amenities that your council otherwise would not be able to achieve. You don't have the money, you don't have the legal positioning to be able to achieve it. I'm telling you this is because often this most powerful tool that's important for better city making, sometimes community activists themselves are telling council to not do it. And that's problematic because it's an incredibly important tool for you moving forward. You need to be on board with it. You need to make sure it's done well, that you never do stupid density just to get a community development or benefit, and I'll tell that to council too. That's tail wagging the dog. But you need to support this tool. It's a very powerful tool, and thank God the planning system in Canada allows for it, because how else are you going to get daycare? How else are you going to get community facilities? And your municipal budget can't achieve the kinds of things often that are getting paid for. If anything, my advice to staff is going to be to ramp up your use of community and density bonusing. I tell you that because there are probably people in this audience who have lobbied council to not do it because they're accusing council of wanting to sell zoning. That kind of narrative fits in perfectly with the aspirations of the developers who also want council to not do it for other reasons. Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Okay, back over to this side. Yes, sir. Second row in the middle.
So I'll just jump right to a question. I'm very familiar with Vancouver. I suspect part of this is land ownership complexity that's in Kingston, but I wondered if you could speak a little bit to, and I'm just going to give you two quick images. I love the tall buildings of downtown in Vancouver and curling in past the marina into Stanley Park, and I love how hidden the Lionsgate Bridge is. And so a lot of this has been about built form and things that we can create, but I'm just wondering about natural opportunities. So when I came to Kingston, which I guess is about 7.5 years ago, I look at the Novellis lands, former Alcan lands, and I see a High Park. I see a Stanley Park. And, you know, it's already been, to my mind, ruined by putting a gas station on the corner. You know, but there's still some natural stuff left. I'm just wondering how this densification things can actually exploit natural opportunities and how individual areas of the city can take on their own distinct character. Which Vancouver, to my mind, has done really well. And one bad example, and then I'll let you speak. Victoria, I was shocked, devastated when I was back in Victoria and I looked at where Rattenberry's was over the Parliament buildings, and it's like downtown Yonge and Dundas in Toronto now, with condo towers and steel and glass, and I'm staring at the totem poles at the museum, and you turn around and it's just like it just seems like it's the wrong location. So, and I think that's what a lot of what I've heard in Kingston too. So how do you maximize the right location and not the wrong location, not in a build-by-build specific thing, but in a larger planning sort of scope? Thank you.
I can't comment on Victoria because I haven't worked for them. I haven't studied their situation well enough well, I have worked for them, but I haven't studied this situation well enough to speak intelligently on it. I do, especially when you've got a historic backdrop, the question of what you can see in the context of that historic backdrop is important, and it's certainly important for you. I don't necessarily buy into the language that when you're in a historic setting, you should be able to look around and pretend it's still 100 years ago because there's no tall buildings. I don't mind the idea that you can perceive tall buildings in the context of historic places. I don't mind that. Because I know that those tall buildings may be achieving a lot of public interest goals, including body heat to support downtown retailers and all sorts of things that make it worth it. But what I make sure is that there be a very robust conversation about the quality of those tall buildings, because they shouldn't damage and distract from the experience you have in a historic place. And the presence of a tall building, in my opinion, doesn't damage or distract, but the presence of a too big, ugly tall building easily can. It's psychologically how the eye is drawn to something that's too big or too ugly. So that's part of the subjective, to be sure, urban design analysis that gets done when you're doing this kind of thing. The starting point of your conversation, I think, was about natural assets. And I think it's a great question. If I gave a more robust description about how to do density well, I would probably have a specific subsection about integrating nature and green into density as you densify. Large natural places like Stanley Park, smaller natural places, connection to the mountains, which we do through our view corridors policy in Vancouver, and integrating green everywhere. Street tree policies, urban canopy policies. As you densify, there's no reason why you can't be green, and a lot of reasons why you should be green as you densify. And of course, extra opportunities like vertical growing medium, green walls, living walls, green roofs, rooftop gardens, overlapping it with agriculture and food production. There's all sorts of opportunities how to take the integration of nature into an urban setting, which I think can and should be part of the densification conversation. But if your densification conversation is simple and cookie cutter, as somebody used, you're probably not having those conversations.
Okay, over here. Yes, in the front.
Hello, my name is Robert Kiley. Mr. Toderian, thank you for opening your conversation by challenging us to move on from the status quo, to move beyond the way things have been done traditionally. I think that's needed in planning, as in policy, and in politics. As an MPP candidate, I'm fascinated about the intersection and the impact of provincial legislation on the sustainability of communities. Now, you mentioned that you worked in Australia and New Zealand and British Columbia, and in all those locations, higher levels of government have instituted a carbon tax. And I'm wondering if you could talk about the potential ramifications of carbon taxation on the sustainability of local communities.
It's a pretty high-order question. But carbon tax is connected to this conversation in the sense that if you seriously want to have a conversation about addressing congestion, which is different than giving choices for mobility, it's do you want to have fewer cars on your streets and roads relative to the space? The only tool that actually can succeed in doing that is congestion pricing. The financial tools and mechanisms, and they have to be robust enough. We've had a carbon tax in Vancouver for many years. There is a robust conversation going on right now. I'm literally going back from this to taking part in a panel on carbon taxation in Metro Vancouver about taking it to the next level, road pricing throughout the region, more tolls, etc. Because if you want to have a serious conversation about lowering congestion and shifting modes additionally, carbon taxes have to be part of that conversation. That's all I probably should say in this context, because I have no idea what the Ontario conversation has been on carbon taxing. But I have no problem saying what I just said as being true.
Okay, over on this side. Yes, second row just on the aisle.
Thank you, sir, for coming to our city and educating all of us tonight. I think it's a very historic occasion. You're the champion of change who's visiting this week, so thank you for that. There's been a number of questions and points about parking, and I want to tie that into the availability of information and open government. And we have open government as a priority of council, and we've been discussing parking, and the question was raised, more parking downtown and so forth, and it's a very complicated topic. But in terms of getting information on what the business situation is with the city's parking is a problem. I've been trying to address that. I know people on council have been as well. Getting the information on the lots that we have and how they're utilized, right? So there's discussion about wanting to replace the parking on which large towers are to be built. So I'm sure you've had these battles where you've had information impasses. You're the chief planner and you've got other departments that maybe aren't quite on board with the pace that you want to move change to make a better city. So I'm just wondering, maybe in terms of getting a practical answer, information is key. You have to have information being shared to have a proper discussion. And if it's being held back, you simply can't have proper discussion. So I'm wondering you might be able to just talk about a practical way of maybe getting the change to occur so that these conversations can actually happen. Not only with parking, it's the example I've taken, but other similar situations. All of the density bonusing and height in the right place and that sort of thing. Because it really is a culture change. People in the community are frustrated with this in terms of dealing with city staff. We get the answers sometimes, but not all the time. So thank you.
I'm not sure if some of that was rhetorical, but what I'll say is I'm a strong supporter of data-based planning, information-based planning, fact-based planning. It shouldn't be about gut feel in a lot of contexts. So your starting point of knowing the information is critical. That's not a criticism to staff. It takes a lot of work to gather information, and they're trying to put out fires and dance on the head of a pin and fly the airplane while it's being built. Pick your metaphor. All at the same time with a relatively small staff by comparison, even to other cities your size. So there are huge challenges associated with it. Should you get base data on things like parking supply, parking usage, etc.? Absolutely. Is that easy? Not necessarily, because you're trying to get a whole bunch of things. Data and recognition of your starting point is key, though. On something like parking, for example, knowing how your parking is used, and certainly we always knew that in Vancouver, could be the basis for your decision to trend down on your parking standard, because we had the benefit of the information that says the parking lots are only 70% full anyway, or 60% full. In Vancouver at the time it was half full, half were empty, which gave us a great political positioning to lower the parking standard moving forward. We also could say, well, the situation is they're 80% full, but it's dedicated parking. And what if we made a tweak to the parking operations strategy and turned it to scramble parking, for example? Suddenly that opens up 20% of capacity, which means we don't necessarily have to build that parking garage we think we had. So having the data, tweaking it based on operational scenarios that you, in a good parking strategy, would consider, could end up being the difference between a decision about whether to build something or not. So pretty darn important to have that data.
Okay, back over on this side. Yes, ma'am. Third row back.
Hi, well, thank you. This is a great discussion, and I have, in some respect, a lot of questions, so it's going to be hard for me to kind of narrow it down to the one question that I'm supposed to ask. And so here's a little bit the context. You talked about, the density, good density. I'm still kind of struggling with how do you actually then, for City of Kingston, how do you determine what density is the right density for, I guess, say the city overall or in various areas, or how do we kind of come to that? Yeah. You also talked about the plan and how the plan is the thing that should guide our decision. Well, that's what I've been saying a long time, and I feel that the city has not used the plan, the official plan, I assume you're referring to, as the guidance to make the decisions. And so we have these proposals that come forward that are 20-story in an area where, well, the plan says, 8 stories maybe maximum or something. So there is that contradiction there. So I'm not really sure where you stand on that when you have that scenario, right? That we have a plan where it feels that a developer can come with a proposal that is, out to lunch, I would say, or totally out of context of what the plan would suggest there should be built. And so where do you sit in that scenario? And then the question would be, so if we have a plan
I'm going to
that's
forget your first questions if you keep going with
Okay,
more.
but they all hang together, and you don't
down.
have to necessarily answer the one or the other. But so there, there's the plan, and then if there is a new way to do things, then what do we do in the interim? Like we have to adhere to the plan or should not,
right.
or so that's where I'm kind of struggling with what I've heard tonight. You kind of discuss.
I can't comment on your plan because I haven't studied it in depth, your current plan. So I can't comment on whether the plan should have been adhered to or not adhered to. I can't comment on the specific wording, the intent versus the clarity versus the flexibility. But since I've left City Hall in Vancouver, I've worked on, I think, 6 or 7 or 8 citywide plans. And my philosophy and perspective on plans is that they should be clear where they should be clear, and they should be flexible where they should be flexible. And you should know the difference about what's clear and what's flexible, and you should have strategically decided where you need clarity and where you need flexibility. Good plans are a duality of that. In certain cases, you want to be clear on what's allowed because you wanted to do many things, including giving the community certainty on what they can expect to see in the context of the vision, and from the other end, enough clarity for the developers that they know how much to pay for land, which is a critically important responsibility of City Hall. You have to provide enough clarity so that you don't have the problem for yourself of developers overpaying for land. Or if they do, it's their own fault. On the other hand, plans should not be fixed, static documents. There should be enough in it that stands the test of time over time, because plans are forward-looking, but they should have the flexibility to know a better idea when they hear it and be able to move forward on that better idea. And I always said, when I was chief planner, I have no problem saying I'm the first arbitrator of whether it's a better idea. And ultimately, that arbitrator becomes council. There should be, because I don't want a rule or a standard or a plan to ever stand in the way of a better idea if it matches the public interest. The art is to know when to be clear and when to be flexible. So I can't comment on any individual decisions relating to your plan. That is my comment on how plans should be made. And there probably needs to be some specific clarity and conversation about how where your plan provides clarity versus providing flexibility, so that when the community or developers see something, they can understand why there's been either flexibility or not flexibility applied. But let me push it back on you. I've heard many, many times from communities, I can't believe you didn't listen to our plan, when the clear intent of the plan was to provide opportunities for flexibility. So you are listening to the plan because the plan intended to have flexibility. But often, community doesn't want to hear that because they wanted you to just do what the plan initially said. So a lot depends on how the plan is written. And maybe that's the way your plan is written. Paige, I don't know if you want to comment on it. I'm not an expert on your plan, your current plan.
Thank you, and through you. So to build on what Brent has just had to say, our plan actually has both. Our plan has a lot of clarity, especially with respect to downtown, and I think as a community, and we've talked about this a number of times in public sessions, the importance of reading the plan in its wholeness, in its entirety. You can't just read certain sections of the plan and not have regard for other sections of the plan. It's an entire document. So where our plan certainly has clarity with respect to giving an overall direction related to downtown and a height limitation, our plan at the same time also has flexible policy that says taller buildings, more dense buildings can happen anywhere in the downtown, subject to an urban design study. And this is where we've struggled a little bit as a community, and there's work to be done with respect to the policy, because right now we have a lot of clarity butted up against something that is entirely flexible. And the two of them at times can seem like they're at opposition to one another. And there's a lot of work that goes into the discussions between city staff and an applicant and trying to find what is actually meant by good urban design. And some of it can be subjective, and there's a lot of work that the city has to do in getting a lot more clear and specific about what we mean by that as a city. And that's some of the work that we'll be carrying forward.
Okay, back over to this side. Yes, sir, at the back in the white shirt.
Thank you. I appreciate all the conversation about density and streetscape. I want to get a little more granular, if you could, and help us with some guidance in terms of how you proportion office use versus residential use. One of the things we're seeing right now is it's pretty quiet in the mornings during the daytime in our downtown urban context. Amazing on the weekends, great at night. But I'm just wondering how you get the right proportions.
I love that question because I've thought a few times in the last 48 hours, I can't believe we haven't talked about office space. And that's because so much of the tension and so much of the controversy is being associated with some of these residential projects. In Vancouver, for example, we passed a moratorium banning residential conversions that were happening in our central business district because it was eroding our ability to meet our long-term objectives for office space capacity. The moratorium became a permanent ban, and then we had to find, and our math showed us in the analysis we did that not only did we had to keep the moratorium in place, we needed to find 5.5 million additional square feet of office space to meet our demands even to 2030. I say all that because in our effort in Vancouver to build all that housing under what was called by my predecessor, who was a brilliant urbanist, the Living First strategy, we probably went a little too far toward that. And then when I came in, I had to say, well, whoa, we're so living that we're not working. And good downtowns need a balance. You need to have, part of your vision should be, how much office space do you want in the central core? How much housing do you want in the central core? Presumably you're hoping for an interrelationship so people can walk to work and live close to work. But that's a core. My general answer to you is there should absolutely be in a complete and balanced downtown that kind of interrelationship. I hope your downtown, your either existing plan or your evolving downtown thinking answers that question. But we've been talking with your staff about setting targets as opposed to projections. How much office do you want to have in your downtown? How much do you need to be able to facilitate those walking and biking trips that meet your mode shift goals from a transportation and active transport perspective? That becomes all part of the vision. And I'm seeing Paige nodding, so I'm presuming either that's already there or part of the current conversation.
Okay, thank you. Over on this side. Yes, sir, down at the back corner at the...
First, thank you to council and staff for organizing, and obviously to Brent for a great presentation. You had a lot of great principles and ideas that you brought forth, a lot that I agree with. I'm a former planner and current developer with Podium Developments. We have a number of projects in the city of Kingston at the moment, and you know, as such, we play a key role in how Kingston intensifies. So something that we have as a general opinion is that intensification or density shouldn't just be focused on one area of the city, shouldn't just be focused on the waterfront, or shouldn't just be focused on the community surrounding the university or just the downtown, but that it should be spread out throughout the city so that other parts of Kingston and other neighborhoods and other communities can benefit from the community benefits that are brought forth with development, as well as the commercial that comes with it. So one thing that we strive for is utilizing intensification corridors in the city, key corridors such as Princess Street for Kingston. And I want to understand your opinion on that and how you think those intensification corridors play into the entire process of intensification for a city.
I support the concept of intensification corridors. I haven't gone deep enough with my work with staff to say I support any particular intensification corridor and what intensification would mean in a specific corridor. I'm just not deep enough in that to make any intelligent comments. But in many of the cities I'm working in, the benefit of intensifying in a corridor approach is powerful because it does many things, not just providing your housing supply, but facilitating your transit and getting you to a frequent transit network, which is one of the keys to the success you've already had around public transit. But you can take that transit success to the next level by now integrating it with the intensification strategy. I think you should be able to glean from my presentation and my comments my perspective that densification should be happening everywhere. But the reason I used deliberate language, and even in some cases created new language like gentle density and invisible and hidden density, was because you have to be able to have a conversation about densification without scaring everybody that what you're talking about is tall towers or even mid-rise towers. Now, as you can see from some of my examples, I think there are places within a suburban context where you can do tall towers, where you can do urban, mixed-use, transit-oriented development. But what that means, how big it means, where it is, and importantly where not, is critical. So you're a developer. I have no idea if I would support a particular site you owned. But I do know that the conversation about densification is a citywide conversation, but not with a one-size-fits-all approach.
Okay, back over on this side. Yes, sir.
Oh, good evening. Thanks for your time. My name is Matthew McCartney.
Where are you? I don't see.
Oh, just over here, on your right.
Is it right over on the right-hand side here?
Oh,
it's against the wall.
Yeah. So, as a younger person, obviously, I have like the better part of my life ahead of me, and so urbanism makes sense to me because like it's a sustainable way of moving forward, especially with climate change and all those sorts of things. I thought it was really great how you roped in the upper part of the, like the aging population, because like for accessibility and so on. But I find a struggle personally, like as someone who accepts urbanism as like a good way to move forward, getting buy-in from other people. Like it just makes sense to me, and I struggle sharing that with other people. Whether it be my friends, my neighbors, family, city staff, council, all those sorts of things. I was just wondering if you could maybe share a success story of getting buy-in from people, because like a lot of people have a stake in something else that might hold them back, whether consciously or subconsciously, from moving forward on good things that benefit not just themselves, but other people. Anyways, I just need a little bit of juice.
Well,
thank you.
I think a key to the densification conversation is to have empathy. I don't think people, when they come and tell me what they're afraid of or concerned about, are wrong or bad or selfish or anything like that. I think there's generational differences in the perception of what feels normal and acceptable. I think people who have lived in a community for a long time get used to things. That's human nature. I've had some of your locals on this trip. One of your reporters said to me, I look at the waterfront towers and they don't look that bad at all. And I asked, have you lived here all your life? And he said, yes. It's amazing what you can get used to. But what's the perspective of the young generation? What's the perspective of the tourist? What's the perspective of the new eyes, the fresh eyes? That should matter to you. Generationally, there's a difference. There's studies, I'm a big fan of human psychology as it relates to urbanism. There's studies that show that people are afraid of change by nature, and they tend to value the concept of loss more than the value of gain. So when I talk about the things that can be achieved by density, that's going to resonate less than the fear they have about what they're going to lose. That's human nature. I don't say that's wrong or evil. I have to become a student of human nature if I'm going to have a conversation with the community. So it takes empathy, it takes listening, and it takes the quality of that conversation. So I'll give you that success story you talked about. When we talk about gentle density in the neighborhoods, in the single-family, single-detached neighborhoods in Vancouver, which are actually, in many cases, low density, very low density, the conversation about even a row house as a starting point would be downright controversial. You'd think you were talking about towers by the level of controversy that could get introduced by a townhouse or row house project. But when you have, and because the narrative often, even in the planning documents, is stable neighborhood, like I'm going to protect this neighborhood from change by preventing these housing types. And if you introduce any new housing types, that's going to destabilize the neighborhood. Now, I know you've got some unique challenges here with student housing, etc., but in normal low-density neighborhoods, the narrative is often about the worry of change destabilizing neighborhoods. So in a conversation that I and my staff had in Vancouver around gentle density and such, we went and did a lot of listening about what was happening in the neighborhoods. And what we found is that the population was reducing because empty nesters, as I said a little bit earlier, weren't downsizing in the way we all expected they would. They were hanging on by their fingernails to their big house, even though the kids have long ago left. Why? When we asked them, it's because they love their neighborhood. And all they thought that their house was too big, they weren't going to downsize until they could find a smaller house within their neighborhood because they didn't want to leave their neighborhood. And guess what? There were no housing options for smaller houses within their neighborhoods, so they stayed put. And they were occupying a house that could have been occupied by a family. And they lamented that their kids and grandkids lived out in White Rock, if you know Vancouver, and we never see them. And the school is closing or under threat of closure, and the retail isn't there. And when you start to have those conversations and you talk about all of that change which they don't like in the context of this concept of stability, and said, if we introduce, let's talk about laneway housing, let's talk about row houses. It provides an opportunity for the empty nesters to downsize within the neighborhood. A laneway house does all the things that I think I described a little bit earlier. And your school maybe stays open because one of our goals should be to bring back the kids to the neighborhood. You're listening to their human stories. You're strategic in your responses in terms of housing types. And you can have an honest conversation about the thing they're afraid of, which is change and destabilization, without disrespecting them or just calling them a NIMBY. You can get to an answer that isn't necessarily mid-rise or high-rise, but it's a successful answer in the context of their role in a changing city. And then nearby, you've got an arterial corridor that has mid-rise because mid-rise is the right answer. And over there, you have neighborhood centers and another corridor that has higher order transit on it, and thus you're contemplating tall buildings there because it makes sense in that context. And you're always able to explain why and why not. So my success story for you, I've got plenty of them, but they always involve some empathy, good listening, and a strategic approach to planning. And everybody, sort of treating everybody else with a little more respect, not assuming the worst of people. That's why I say I have no time for narratives like planners are on the take. I never let community groups or anyone get away with accusing my staff of that. Never. But I show an equal amount of respect to the citizen voices that I'm hearing and talking about. Does that make sense?
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's about 10 minutes to 9, so I'm going to take just a couple of more questions. Yes, ma'am, over on the aisle.
Thank you. Also, thank you also from me for coming. It seems to me that you are applying development principles from a very large, very wealthy, and very fast-growing city, and taking these principles and applying them to a much smaller, much slow-growing, and probably not quite as wealthy a city. Do you think there are any limitations on the validity of that transferring of principles?
Ma'am, with all due respect, if that's what it sounds like I'm doing, then I've failed in being clear. Because I thought I'd been really, really deliberate in saying the exact opposite to that. That my principles are not principles that come from a big wealthy city. My principles are from doing this in just about every context you can think of in a lot of parts of Canada and the world, from small towns to big cities. They are universal principles. But even then, I say you have to be smart and strategic in how you apply them to a specific context, because you're not even exactly the same as any other mid-sized city or any other city with the same growth rate of yours. And your staff know that. And if I were a consultant that said, I have the answer for you because I did it in Vancouver, I would run me out of town. Because there are some consultants out there that try to do that. But I'd like to think I've spent all of tonight sending the exact opposite message. What we're talking about is higher order principles that, in my opinion and observation and experience, are universal. But the challenge becomes how it applies to your place and your context and even the moment that you're in right now. Because place can be temporal, not just geographic.
Okay, time for one more question. Yes, sir. We'll just wait for a mic.
Actually, it's a really simple question. Would you like to go out for a beer? Thank you very much.
As I've said, my mother would love that.
Very good. Thank you very much, Ken, for that last question. So again, Brent, thank you very much for that presentation, for your time.
All joking aside, you've got a very good chief planner. I think everyone in this system can do a lot to position your planning department, your chief planner, your representatives from other departments, your transportation officials have made incredible successes. I've met with the senior management team today. You've got good staff. A lot of the challenges they have is they'd like to do better, but it's often and different. But often there's a perception that, is the community ready for that? Is council ready for that, etc.? So one of my core messages is you all have to help each other to achieve this. You're not enemies. You're sort of, let's do a big group hug now. I don't want to sound too wishy-washy, but that's the truth. The more you fight with each other, the lower the quality of the outcome. That I know.
On that note, I think that was a great way to finish off. Thank you again, Mr. Toderian. Okay, so thank you again, everyone, for coming tonight. At this point, Madam Deputy Clerk, I'll ask for bylaws, please.
Moved by Councillor Candon, seconded by Councillor Holland, that bylaw 1 be given its first and second reading.
All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried.
And moved by Councillor Candon and seconded by Councillor Holland, that bylaw 1 be given its third reading.
All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Motion to adjourn, please. Moved by Deputy Mayor Bohm, seconded by Councillor Candon. All those in favor? Opposed? And we are adjourned. Thank you very much.